Hello, curious minds, and welcome to Documentary for Sleep. If you're here tonight, maybe your thoughts are still heavy, or maybe you're simply looking for a softer voice to drift along with. Whether you're lying in bed waiting for sleep to come, cooking with headphones on, or letting this play quietly in the background of a long night shift, this is your space to slow down. Tonight's story takes us into something deeply human: our tears. Not the ones that keep our eyes moist, but the emotional kind, the tears that fall when we're overwhelmed with sadness, touched by joy, or moved by empathy. No other animal sheds tears for feelings the way we do. Why is that? What role did it play in our survival, in our evolution? This is not a channel for wild speculation, but for soft science, grounded in biology, anthropology, and the quiet curiosity of asking why we are the way we are. We don't claim to have all the answers, but we do have the questions, the research, and the willingness to wonder. And if you happen to drift off in the middle, that's perfectly fine. There are timestamps in the description, so you can return tomorrow and pick up right where you left off. If this kind of calm, long-form storytelling helps you relax, focus, or learn a little more about what makes us sapiens unique, consider liking this video and subscribing. It helps this community of curious minds grow. And if you feel like sharing, tell us, do you listen while lying in bed, while traveling, or somewhere quiet halfway across the world? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Have you ever paused to wonder why humans cry? Not when dust irritates the eye, or when the wind blows sharp and cold, but when a feeling arrives, so immense and wordless that the body's only response is to form a liquid testament, to let saltwater trace the contours of a private pain or a sudden, unbearable joy. This is not a reflex. It is a mystery. What is this strange alchemy that transforms an invisible ache into a perfect, tangible drop? Consider first the tear that serves a purpose. The reflex tear is a practical thing, a swift and efficient janitor. It flushes away an eyelash, soothes a scratch, defends against a hostile world. Its value is immediate, its function clear. It is a biological tool, no more philosophically complex than a sneeze. But the emotional tear is a different creature entirely. It appears unbidden, a byproduct not of irritation, but of overwhelm. It serves no obvious physical need. It does not clean. It confesses. It does not protect the cornea. It seems to expose the soul. So why does it exist? Why would evolution favor such a vulnerable, seemingly wasteful leak? We are, as far as we know, the only animal that cries from feeling. Our closest primate relatives may whimper in distress, but they do not shed tears for their sorrows. This act is uniquely, profoundly human, and the chemistry of these tears hints at a deeper purpose. They are not merely salt and water. They contain a concentrated cocktail of hormones: prolactin, adrenocorticotropic hormone, leucine, and enkephalin substances, intimately tied to stress, bonding, and the regulation of pain. It is as if the body, finding itself at an emotional precipice, chooses to brew a potent potion and then, rather than contain it, allows it to spill over the edge. Is this a failure of containment, or a deliberate release? A purge of excess feeling, perhaps, a quiet chemical rebellion against an inner storm? The archaeological record will never yield a fossilized tear. No stone can preserve the shape of that fragile drop. Yet we find evidence of the heart that produced it. We find skeletons, tens of thousands of years old, carefully buried with flowers and tools, suggesting a grief so deep it demanded ritual. We find the remains of individuals who lived for years with severe disabilities, proof of a community that offered care and compassion. These are the silent echoes of emotional lives, the footprints of love and loss that must have been accompanied by the same hot, silent tears we know today. They did not need to paint their tears on cave walls. Their actions were the testament. Their care for the vulnerable and their rituals for the dead speak of an inner world rich enough to require this most human of overflows. In our modern world, the tear has become a universal currency of feeling. It falls in the dim light of a movie theater, a private response to a shared story. It marks the final goodbye at an airport, the crushing weight of a personal failure, or the bewildering warmth of a profound kindness. We often dismiss it as a sign of weakness, a loss of control. But what if we have it backwards? What if the tear is not a failure of strength, but a sophisticated tool of social survival? A silent signal of trust, a nonverbal plea for connection that bypasses the clumsy inefficiency of language. In a room full of words, a single tear can say more than all of them combined. So, if the emotional tear has no clear biological function for the individual body, if it doesn't clean or protect the eye, then what is its true purpose? Is it simply the body's pressure valve, a necessary release for a heart grown too heavy? Or is it something more communicative? The answer may not lie in what the tear washes away, but in what it carries. For this is not just salt water. It is a message, written in a biochemical code, waiting to be read. And if a tear is a message, then what, precisely, is it trying to say? If you were to place a single tear of emotion under a microscope, what would you see? Not just salt and water, but a shimmering, intricate map of sorrow itself. A biological chart of a feeling, drawn in the language of proteins and hormones. It is a silent, liquid story waiting to be read. Not all tears are created equal. The ones that spring to your eyes when chopping an onion or when a speck of dust invades are simple things. They are reflexive tears, a basic saline solution meant to rinse and protect. They are functional, a biological mop. But emotional tears are something else entirely. They feel different on the skin, warmer somehow, and their chemical composition reveals a far more complex purpose. It is as if they were designed not just to cleanse the eye, but to communicate a state of the soul. They are a message in a bottle, written from the inside and sent out into the world. At the biological layer, this message is written in a potent cocktail of molecules. Emotional tears carry a higher concentration of proteins, but the true messengers are more specific. They contain prolactin, a hormone central to lactation and bonding, a chemical whisper of nurturing and attachment. They carry ACTH, a stress-signaling hormone, a direct biological echo of internal turmoil. And perhaps most poetically, they are laced with enkephalin, a natural painkiller, an endogenous opioid meant to soothe the very ache that triggered the tear's fall. This is not mere waste. This is a precise pharmacological response. The body, in its profound wisdom, is not just expressing pain, it is attempting to chemically mediate it, to offer a drop of solace even as it signals distress. Is crying, then, the body's way of hugging itself from the inside? We cannot excavate ancient tears from the fossil record. This primal language leaves no mineral trace. Yet, we can look to our closest relatives for clues to its archaic origins. In the plaintive cries of a primate infant separated from its mother, we see the raw precursor. The cry is a signal, a beacon of need. In the grooming and gentle touching between female chimpanzees after a conflict, we see the response to that signal, the comfort offered, the social bond repaired. The tear, then, might have evolved as a silent, visible amplification of that cry. It is a signal that is impossible to ignore, a glistening badge of vulnerability that disarms aggression and compels connection. Was the first emotional tear a silent scream that became a silent summons? In the intricate theater of modern human society, this biological signal has been woven into the very fabric of our communication. A tear rolling down a cheek in a boardroom, at a funeral, or during a heartfelt conversation is a powerful, wordless language. It can be a white flag of surrender, a request for help too profound for words. It can be a tool for empathy, bypassing logic and striking directly at the heart of the witness, compelling them to understand, to comfort, to align. It can even, on a darker note, be a calculated instrument to manipulate a situation, to sway opinion or guilt another into action. In a world saturated with words, the silent tear remains one of the most potent and unambiguous signals we possess. But does its power lie in its honesty or in our deep, evolved instinct to respond to it? This leads us to a quiet evolutionary paradox. Many animals vocalize their pain, the whale's mournful song, the chimpanzee's distressed shriek, the dog's lonely howl. These are clear signals of distress. But why, of all the creatures on Earth, did humans alone develop this silent, salty overflow of emotion? Why add visible tears to the audible cry? Was it an evolutionary luxury? a refinement of communication that allowed for more nuanced bonds, for deeper and more complex social structures? Or is the tear, perhaps, the price we pay for the depth of our feeling, the necessary overflow of a consciousness that knows its own sorrow? If emotion is the music, is the tear its only true, unforced instrument? And this very question pulls our gaze away from our own reflections and out toward the rest of the animal kingdom. We hear their calls of pain and see their behaviors of grief, but it forces us to wonder. The mother elephant stands vigil over the still body of her calf. Her great head is bowed, the end of her trunk resting gently on the small, lifeless form. A slow, glistening track traces a path through the dust on her weathered cheek. To any human heart, the image is unmistakable. She is weeping. We see our own grief reflected in her posture, in her silence, in that single, telltale tear. But is this a shared language of sorrow, or are we merely reading our own story onto hers, projecting a human experience onto a creature that may feel deeply, but expresses that depth in a foreign tongue? Across the animal kingdom, we witness behaviors that echo our own rituals of mourning. A pod of dolphins will keep a silent vigil, supporting their dead companion at the surface for days. A chimpanzee mother, stricken by the death of her infant, might carry its desiccated body for weeks, her slow movements and withdrawn demeanor speaking of a profound loss. A dog, waiting by the door for an owner who will never return, whines and refuses to eat. These are not mere reflexes. They are complex, sustained responses to death and separation. They suggest an inner world rich with feeling. Yet, for all this visible anguish, science draws a stark line. While these creatures may grieve, they do not, as far as we can prove, shed emotional tears. Theirs is a pain without the specific, salty catharsis that we know. Biologically, the machinery is often there. Elephants, along with many other mammals like dogs and our primate cousins, possess lacrimal glands nearly identical to our own. These glands produce tears constantly, a basal secretion that keeps the eye lubricated and safe. They can also flood the eye in response to physical insult, a gust of dust, a piece of grit, the sharp sting of smoke. This is a purely physiological reaction, a clever bit of evolutionary plumbing designed to protect a delicate organ. An elephant might weep from a scratched cornea, just as we would, but when her world collapses with the death of her calf, her body does not translate that seismic emotional shift into a flow of tears. Her despair is expressed in a chorus of low-frequency rumbles we can barely hear, in a tangible stillness, in the profound language of absence. She feels, but does she cry? Times from times the feeling. If we look back through the deep time of our own lineage, the plot thickens. Archaeologists and primatologists observe what they call thanatological behaviors in our prehistoric primate ancestors and our closest living relatives. We see evidence of proto-mourning, the guarding of a body, the gentle grooming of the dead, the confusion and quiet that follows a death in the troop. These acts hint at the dawn of an emotional consciousness, a dawning awareness of loss and the fragile thread of life. But crucially, there is no evidence, no symbolic art, no burial site, no physiological clue to suggest that times Australopithecus, times, or early times, Homo times, shed tears of grief. This void in our shared history suggests that emotional crying is not some ancient, universal mammalian inheritance. It appears to be a startlingly recent innovation, a peculiar signature perhaps unique to time's Homo sapiens. Our modern world, saturated with anthropomorphism, constantly blurs this line. We see the wet fur beneath a gorilla's eyes and call it weeping. We watch a YouTube video of a dog whimpering and interpret the moisture in its eyes as sadness. In our desire to connect, to see a reflection of our own souls in the eyes of the beasts we share the planet with, we gift them our own most human expressions. But in doing so, we risk missing the profound truth of their time's experience. The real boundary may not be between who feels and who does not, but in how that feeling is translated into the physical world. We stand on one side of a vast expressive canyon, using our tears as a signal flare, while they communicate their sorrow in a frequency we are still learning to hear. So if we are, in fact, the only animal that cries from emotion, we are left with a haunting evolutionary puzzle. Why us? What strange pressure selected for this bizarre, salty leakage of feeling? Was it a social glue, A nonverbal signal of vulnerability that helped bind our tribes together? Was it a physical release for emotions too complex for our growing brains to contain? Or is it the price we pay for our particular kind of consciousness, the inevitable overflow from a vessel that knows it is fragile? The tear, then, is not just a drop of salt water, but a question. What does it mean that we are the only species that cries, and what does that solitary signal say about the unique weight of being human? Perhaps the answer lies not in the biology of the tear duct, but in the shadowy space between a reflex and an expression, a space where a simple physical reaction transforms into something far more mysterious. The knife meets the onion, and the familiar sting follows. Your eyes well up, a swift and efficient response to a chemical irritant. Across town, in a quiet room, a different kind of tear traces a slow path down a cheek, born not of vaporized sulfoxides but of a silent, internal fracture, the aching absence of a loved one. Two events, two tears. To the casual observer, they are the same salty discharge, but your brain knows the profound difference. It knows the chasm between a reflex and an expression. How does it tell them apart? The answer is written not just in our biology, but in the very story of how we became human. Not all tears spring from the same wellspring within us. Researchers draw a clear, physiological line between reflexive tears, the body's swift, utilitarian answer to an external assault like dust, wind, or onion fumes, and emotional tears, a mysterious and uniquely human response to an internal, psychological landscape. They are distinct languages spoken by the body, and they are activated from entirely different neighborhoods of the brain. This is the first clue that one is a simple alarm, while the other is something far more complex, a message in a bottle sent from the shores of our deepest selves. The biological tale begins with the lacrimal gland, a small, almond-shaped architect of our sorrow and relief. But it is merely the instrument. The conductors are separate. Reflexive tears are summoned by the brainstem, the most ancient and primal part of our neural anatomy. This is the old guard, the automated system that manages our heartbeat and our breath. It operates on a simple stimulus and response loop: foreign particle detected, tear ducts activated, irritant flushed. It is pure, unthinking survival. Emotional tears, however, follow a far more winding path. Their origin is the limbic system, the deep and shadowed seat of emotion, memory, and motivation. When grief, joy, or overwhelming empathy washes through this neural center, it can send a signal that overrides the simpler circuits, commanding the lacrimal gland to produce its unique, chemical-rich tears. This simple anatomical fact is profound. It suggests that emotional crying is no biological accident, no mere overflow valve for excess feeling. It is, instead, a deliberate product of evolution, a feature that was selected for and refined. It had a purpose. This leads us to the archaeological layer of our story, to the deep time of our evolution. As the human brain expanded, blossoming with a massive prefrontal cortex and a more intricate limbic network, our social world grew exponentially more complex. We were no longer just individuals surviving. We were a tribe, a community, a network of interdependent minds. In this new world, raw emotion was not enough. We needed to communicate it, to broadcast our internal states to others. Expressive behaviors, the laugh, the gasp, the smile, and the tear became a critical social language, a pre-verbal grammar of connection. These tears did not just passively reflect an inner feeling, they actively created feeling in others. A child's cry brings a running parent. A friend's silent tears at a loss compel an embrace. This was a revolutionary development. The tear evolved from a mere physiological response into a potent social signal, a tool for bonding, for eliciting aid, for building the trust that would hold communities together. Was this the moment the tear transformed from a simple reaction into a form of communication, a silent yet powerful word in the lexicon of human connection? This brings us to the uncomfortable, shimmering reality of the modern social layer. We live in a world that often feels ambivalent about this most ancient signal. A person crying in public creates a palpable tension. It is not usually annoyance we feel, but a deep, resonant discomfort. Their vulnerability becomes a mirror, and in it, we glimpse the potential for our own pain. their silent signal is received by our own limbic systems, triggering an echo of their distress. This is empathy, the visceral, often unsettling ability to feel times with times another. This emotional contagion, this strange telepathy of feeling transmitted by a glistening cheek, is the very bedrock of compassion. It is the biological and social mechanism that compels us to reach out, to offer a tissue, a hand, a word of comfort. It forces us out of our solitary shells and into a shared experience. But why does this shared experience so often feel so awkward, so heavy? Is it because we are feeling their pain, or because we fear our own inability to heal it? So we arrive at a tentative observation, a single slice of a much larger truth. The tear has shed its purely biological skin. It is no longer just about lubrication or protection. It has been co-opted by our social souls and forged into a tool of immense power. It can disarm aggression, summon help, forge an instant bond between strangers, and testify to a joy or sorrow too deep for words. It is a signal of surrender that somehow grants strength, a display of weakness that can wield immense influence. If this is true, if the emotional tear is indeed a refined instrument of human social evolution, then we are left with a question that reverberates back through our entire history. What else, then, has this silent tool been used for? A person stands, utterly silent. The words have fled, retreating from a pain too vast for vocabulary. The world expects a sound, a plea, an explanation, but the throat offers only a choked stillness, and yet a single, warm tear traces a path down their cheek. It is a message delivered without a single syllable. In our deepest moments of powerlessness, when language fails us completely, tears often appear. They are not merely biological overflow, not just saline to cleanse the eye. They feel like something more primal, a final, desperate dialect spoken by the body itself, a language of pure, unedited emotion that can convey profound hurt, a silent plea for help, or even a wordless apology that feels more sincere than any scripted speech. This silent language is perhaps our most universal. It crosses cultures and eras, a shared grammar of feeling. We see it in the grief of a fresh loss, the overwhelming joy of a long-awaited reunion, the frustrated anger of a dream shattered. In these moments, the body takes over from the mind. It bypasses the clumsy, often inadequate tools of speech and communicates directly from the source of the feeling. A sob can be misunderstood, a shouted word can be misheard, but a tear, its meaning, in context, is hauntingly clear. It is a white flag raised from a besieged soul, a signal fire lit on the shores of isolation. Beneath the skin, this emotional alchemy has a precise chemical recipe. When distress or overwhelming joy floods the system, the brain triggers a release. The pituitary gland secretes hormones like adrenocorticotropic hormone, a messenger of stress, but also, curiously, oxytocin and prolactin. These are the chemicals of bonding, of connection, of lactation and love. They course through us as we cry, creating a paradoxical state, a private, internal storm that simultaneously primes us for comfort and attachment. The act of crying, then, is not a passive leakage, but an active physiological event. It is the body's attempt to self-soothe, to chemically purge a surplus of feeling, to recalibrate a system pushed to its emotional limits. But the true magic of this process is not just what it does for the crier, but the signal it sends outward. Functional MRI studies have shown that witnessing someone cry, or even seeing images of tears, triggers a distinct response in the observer's brain. The amygdala, our alarm center for threat and emotion, lights up. But so does the mirror neuron system, the neural architecture that allows us to simulate and understand the actions and intentions of others. We don't just see the tear, we feel, in a faint echo, the impulse that created it. We are neurologically wired to receive this wordless message. It is a silent siren song that compels empathy, that bypasses our critical, analytical cortex and speaks directly to our ancient, emotional core. From an evolutionary standpoint, it is a masterpiece of social signaling, a broadcast of vulnerability that is both a cry for help and a powerful tool for building cohesion. It signals distress without aggression, summons aid without a sound. We can imagine this mechanism playing out on the vast, unforgiving savannas of our deep past. In early hunter-gatherer bands, survival was a group project. An individual's weakness could mean danger for all, yet so could a lack of cohesion. In this delicate balance, raw, verbal expressions of pain, screams, roars of anger, could be ambiguous. They could signal a predator's attack, a rival's challenge, or internal conflict. But tears, they are a quieter, more specific signal. The heaving shoulders, the glistening cheeks, the soft, ragged inhalations. This was a performance of vulnerability that was difficult to fake. It was a nonverbal call for backup that strengthened social bonds precisely because it displayed a need for them. The one who could not speak, perhaps wounded or overcome with grief, could still summon the tribe with the eloquence of their emotion. In responding to this signal, the group reaffirmed its unity, its shared humanity. The tear was not a sign of individual failure, but a social lubricant, a glue that mended the tiny fractures that constantly threatened to pull the community apart. This ancient dynamic did not vanish with the advent of modern society. It simply found new theaters in which to perform. Today, the language of tears continues to regulate behavior and negotiate social contracts, often with startling efficiency. In the stark, rational arena of a courtroom, where logic is king and evidence is currency, a defendant's genuine tears can introduce a variable the law never fully codified: raw humanity. A spoken apology can sound rehearsed, a lawyer's tactic. But an apology accompanied by tears often feels like a crack in the armor, a glimpse of authentic remorse that can subtly sway a jury's perception of character and, by extension, their judgment. It is a non-verbal plea for mercy that can feel more persuasive than any legal argument. Similarly, the entire industry of filmmaking is built upon harnessing this primal language. Directors and actors are, in a sense, linguists of lacrimation. They choreograph moments designed to elicit this specific response, understanding that a character's tears are a direct conduit to the audience's heart. When we watch a character break down, we do not just observe their story, we are invited to participate in it. Our own mirror neurons fire, our own empathy is engaged, and the boundary between the screen and ourself momentarily blurs. We cry not for pixels of light, but because on a fundamental level, we have understood a message meant for us. The tear on screen is a key that unlocks our own emotional reservoirs. So if we accept that tears form a language, a complex, biologically grounded, socially powerful dialect of emotion, where does that leave our silent, wordless individual? Their message has been sent, encoded in saltwater and sentiment. It has been received, processed by ancient neural pathways in those who witness it. It is a language that predates all our dictionaries and grammars, a testament to a time when feeling and communication were inseparable. It is the original mother tongue of the human heart. And if this is true, then we are left not with an answer, but with a deeper, more archaeological question. This language of tears, so intrinsic to who we are, when did its first word form? When did the first hominin experience not just pain or sadness, but a moment of feeling so utterly overwhelming that the body's only response was to speak it through the eyes? The story of this profound communication likely does not begin with a single tear, but with the dawn of the communities that made them meaningful. It begins with the first beings who knew not just how to survive together, but how to hurt for one another, how to remember a loss, and how to say a goodbye that was too deep for words. It begins with the evolution of the moment of overflow itself. For if a tear is a message, then its origin must lie in the birth of the specific, profound emotional capacity that required such a signal. What evolutionary pressure could possibly give rise to such a vulnerable, yet powerful act? What was the first spark that allowed a feeling to become so immense it could no longer be contained and had to manifest in a visible, physical cascade? The answer must lie buried in the deep time of our emotional awakening, in the moment the human heart learned not just to feel, but to break. There is a moment, profoundly and uniquely human, where the world seems to press in just a little too hard. A symphony swells to its final note. A long-lost friend steps through a doorway. A memory surfaces with the force of a tidal wave. The breath catches in the throat, the chest tightens, and the world blurs at the edges as the first tear traces a hot path down the cheek. This is the moment of breaking open. Not a collapse, but a release. A silent, shimmering surrender to a feeling too vast to be contained within the fragile architecture of the self. What is this strange, universal alchemy that transforms overwhelming inner pressure into this quiet, liquid overflow? This emotional crescendo, this breaking point, feels intensely private, a solitary storm in a teacup, yet it is anything but. It is the culmination of an ancient evolutionary script, written in the very wiring of our nerves. It is a biological pressure valve, a fail-safe designed by millions of years of trial and error. When the cognitive load of being, the grief, the joy, the sheer, stunning beauty of existence exceeds the brain's capacity to process it, the system does not shut down. Instead, it finds a release. The carefully constructed dams of our composure, the social filters and logical controls we maintain, are momentarily overruled by a deeper, older command. The result is not a malfunction, but a masterfully engineered reset. A temporary, necessary collapse that allows the whole intricate machine to keep on running. At its core, this moment is a neurological symphony conducted in the oldest concert halls of the brain. The limbic system, the seat of our primal emotions, sounds the alarm. The amygdala, our ever-vigilant sentinel for threat and reward, fires a signal of overwhelming significance. This alert races to the hypothalamus, the command center that links the nervous system to the body's physical orchestra. The signal is clear. The system is in crisis. And so, the hypothalamus sends out its own command, triggering the autonomic nervous system. The breath hitches, the heart clenches, and almost as an afterthought, a secondary signal is dispatched to the lacrimal glands. The tears begin to flow. This is not a sign of weakness, but of a system wisely managing its own limits. It is a biological circuit breaker, tripping to prevent a more catastrophic meltdown. The body, in its infinite wisdom, chooses a controlled leak over a total explosion. Is this the price we pay for feeling so deeply, a temporary loss of control to maintain a permanent capacity for feeling at all? To understand the true purpose of this breakdown, we must travel back through deep time to the flickering firelight of our earliest communities. In that world of constant peril and fragile bonds, emotions were not abstract internal states. They were social signals, vital for survival. A moment of profound loss, the death of a child, a hunter lost to the savannah, was not just a personal tragedy. It was a communal one, weakening the tribe's cohesion. The raw, unfiltered expression of that grief, the guttural cries and the public tears, served a purpose. It was a ritual of bonding, a visible, audible testament to a shared value. It said, "This pain matters to all of us." Similarly, the tears of a victorious return or a miraculous reunion were a public affirmation of the bonds that held the group together. These moments of collective emotional release were the glue of society, a primal language that predated words. In a world where isolation meant death, could the ability to publicly display overwhelming emotion have been as crucial as the ability to wield a spear? This ancient heritage echoes strangely in our modern world. Why do we sit alone in a darkened cinema and weep at the fate of fictional characters? Why does a particular chord progression in a piece of music, arrangement of notes and harmonies, have the power to unlock a flood of feeling we didn't even know we were holding back? We cry at a wedding video, at a commercial, at the overwhelming kindness of a stranger. This is the work of our social brain, a network so finely tuned to connection that it can find profound meaning in the symbolic and the abstract. The story on the screen becomes a vessel for our own unspoken stories. The music becomes a key to a locked room inside us. It is a moment of pure, unmediated empathy, where the boundary between self and other dissolves. We are not crying for the character, but with the part of ourselves that recognizes their humanity. In these moments, are we practicing a kind of emotional communion, connecting across time and space to the very essence of what it means to be part of a tribe? And so, this moment of breaking open, of vulnerability, reveals itself as something far more potent than a simple release. The very act that feels like a surrender is, in the grand calculus of evolution, a strategy. The tear that falls is not just salt water, it is a signal, It is a silent plea and a powerful bond, a communication that bypasses language and speaks directly to the empathetic core of another human being. In that moment of shared feeling, survival is redefined. It is no longer just the survival of the individual body, but the survival of the connection, the relationship, the community upon which the individual ultimately depends. The trembling chin, the glistening cheek, they are not flags of defeat, but rather the white flags of a necessary truce with our own overwhelming humanity, inviting others to witness and, in witnessing, to share the burden. And if a single tear can carry such weight, such ancient and profound meaning, then what other secret histories are written in the language of our bodies? What if this liquid signal, this quiet overflow of the soul, was once not a sign of weakness, but one of our species' most sophisticated tools for survival? In the brutal arithmetic of the primordial world, the weak were a liability. A slow limb, a faltering heart, a mind clouded by fear, these were often sentences of exile, a death delivered not by tooth and claw but by the cold, pragmatic calculus of the tribe. Survival was a numbers game, and every mouth to feed had to pull its weight. But what if you possessed a weapon so subtle, so disarming, that it could halt a raised club, soften a hardened heart, and turn a sentence of abandonment into a promise of care? What if your greatest weakness could be forged into your most potent strength? You would cry. Tears are one of the most potent emotional behaviors, a silent siren call wired deep into our biology. In the symbiotic ecosystems of hunter-gatherer bands, where the survival of one was inextricably linked to the survival of all, this was not merely a display of sadness. It was a sophisticated social tool, a language spoken without words that could stimulate a caregiving response with startling efficiency. It is a signal that bypasses the logic of the hunter and speaks directly to the heart of the protector. A single tear tracing a path through the dust on a cheek can tell a more compelling story than 1,000 pleas. It is vulnerability, weaponized. The biology of this phenomenon is as elegant as it is effective. Scientific studies have shown that the act of seeing tears, not just the sound of crying, but the visual cue of saline fluid welling in the eyes and spilling over, triggers a measurable surge in empathy within the observer's brain. This response is particularly potent when the face is perceived as neotenous, possessing those youthful, vulnerable features. Large eyes, a rounded face, a small chin. It is as if we are hardwired to respond to the distress of those who remind us of our own young. Tears lower aggression, increase feelings of connectedness, and motivate a desire to help. This supports the compelling evolutionary hypothesis that tears developed not as a simple physiological byproduct of stress, but as a dedicated, care-eliciting behavior, a biological adaptation that screamed for help in the most silent and powerful way imaginable. They are not a sign of system failure, but rather the activation of a deeply embedded social safety protocol. We can almost glimpse this ancient negotiation playing out in the shadows of prehistoric fires. Imagine a small band, resources stretched thin, moving across a harsh landscape. A member suffers a gash that will not heal, a fever that will not break. They lag behind. To stop is to risk the group. To carry them is a tremendous energetic cost. The pragmatic decision, the one that cold logic dictates, is clear. But then, the injured one does not snarl or threaten. They simply look down, their shoulders shaking with a silent, weary sorrow. A tear, glistening in the firelight, falls onto the dry earth. In that moment, they are not a burden. They are a child, a sibling, a part of the whole. That single, salty drop recalibrates the entire equation. It transforms a calculation of cost into a covenant of connection. The care they receive is an investment, a down payment on the future reciprocity that defines a social species. Their survival, negotiated through that tear, strengthens the bonds that will ensure the survival of others, and ultimately, the tribe itself. This ancient currency of connection remains legal tender in our modern social world. From the grieved wail of an infant that summons a mother's oxytocin-fueled embrace to the quiet tears of an elder feeling the weight of loneliness, the mechanism is unchanged. We use tears to apologize when words feel hollow, to beg for help when our strength is gone, to express a regret so profound it can only be liquefied. A plea is just a plea, but a plea accompanied by tears is a heart laid bare. In boardrooms and bedrooms, on battlefields and at hospital bedsides, a tear cuts through the noise of modern life and delivers a primal, undeniable message. I am vulnerable, and I need you. It is the glue that maintains the intricate web of human relationships, a web first spun under the vast, starlit skies of our shared past. And yet, for a tool so universal, its access is curiously and cruelly limited. The very societies built on this foundation of empathic connection often police the right to use its most powerful signal. The unspoken rule echoes through schoolyards and sports fields, in corporate hierarchies and family gatherings. Boys don't cry. Men, the heirs to the same evolutionary impulse that gifted us this tool of survival, are often stripped of it by culture. Their tears are met not with an oxytocin surge and an offer of care, but with discomfort, disdain, or derision. Their vulnerability is seen not as a bid for connection, but as a failure of strength. This forces a question that hangs heavy in the air, challenging the very notion of this tool's universality. If tears are indeed our ancient, shared social instrument, a biological birthright for securing care, then what does it mean that an entire half of the population has, for so much of history, been effectively denied its use? Could it be that in the economy of emotion, tears were not a universal currency, but perhaps, originally, the privileged domain of those perceived as the weaker sex? This silent prohibition points to a deeper, more complex truth about the nature of connection itself. If a tear is a signal that demands a response, what happens when the signal is sent but the receiver is culturally programmed not to hear it? The lonely, internal scream of a man who has learned that his grief must remain unshed, uncried, unheld, speaks to a profound fracture in our ancient wiring. It suggests that our need for comfort is absolute, but our permission to ask for it is conditional. And if a tear can build a bridge, its absence can create a chasm of isolated sorrow. So, if a cry is a hand reaching out, what is the silent, stoic alternative? What is the equivalent, unspoken gesture for those who are not allowed to weep? Perhaps the answer lies not in a signal, but in a silence. A different kind of language, one spoken not with the eyes but with the body. A gesture so primal and simple that it predates even the tear itself, a wordless offer of shelter that asks for nothing in return and explains everything. A child cries. It is a sound that cuts through the noise of the world, a sharp, insistent signal of need. Almost instinctively, a mother gathers the small, trembling form into her arms, pulling it close against the warmth of her chest. The crying softens, becomes a hiccup, then a sigh. In this quiet moment, something profound and ancient is exchanged. It is not merely a comfort. It is a complex biological ritual, a silent conversation conducted in the language of hormones and heartbeats. This is the primal embrace, a dance of survival choreographed by evolution itself, where a tear is not a sign of weakness, but a key that unlocks the very bonds that hold us together. This instinct to respond, to hold, and to soothe feels like the most natural thing in the world. We attribute it to love, to compassion, to a moral duty, and while it is all of those things, it is also something more fundamental, something written into the very code of our being. The link between tears, an embrace, and the neurochemical cascade of bonding hormones represents one of the most powerful biological foundations for sustaining human life. It is a system so elegant and so crucial that one might wonder if this, perhaps, is the very reason tears exist at all. They are not merely salty water expelled from ducts. They are a social lubricant, a chemical signal, a silent siren song that compels connection. They are the visible part of an invisible process, a process that begins deep within the most primitive regions of our brain. On a biological level, this embraces a symphony of chemistry. When an infant cries, the sound waves themselves act as a physiological trigger for any caregiver within earshot. It initiates a stress response, a jolt of urgency designed to spur action, but the true magic begins with the holding. As the child is cradled, skin presses against skin. This tactile contact sends a flood of signals to the brain, In the caregiver, the hypothalamus prompts the release of a powerful hormone, oxytocin, often dubbed the love hormone or cuddle chemical. Oxytocin is the architect of attachment. It fosters feelings of trust, reduces anxiety, and promotes nurturing behaviors. It is the biological substrate of empathy, and this exchange is not a one-way street. The child, held and comforted, also experiences a surge of oxytocin, their own tiny stress response system being calmed by the very presence of the caregiver. The tear, then, is the spark. It is not just an expression of distress, it is a sophisticated tool that activates a biological soothing response, a mutually beneficial circuit of calm. It transforms a moment of solitary anguish into a shared physiological state of connection. But if this system is so complex, how deep do its roots truly go? Are we looking at a recent evolutionary development? Or is this a story etched into the bones of our ancient past? The archaeological record offers a silent, yet stunningly eloquent testimony. This need to hold and be held did not begin with us. In the deep shadows of prehistory, we find its echoes. There are cave paintings, crude yet moving, that depict familial units, but the most poignant evidence comes not from art, but from death. In ancient burial sites across the globe, archaeologists have uncovered graves that tell a story of enduring connection. A skeleton of a woman, curled protectively around the smaller bones of a child, their forms arranged in a final, eternal embrace. In another, an adult and an infant buried together, their positions suggesting they were laid to rest while holding one another. These are not random arrangements. They are deliberate, poignant gestures that transcend time and culture. They speak of a grief so powerful it demanded physical expression, and of a love so profound that even death could not completely sever the bond. This evidence suggests that the emotional care encoded in our oxytocin response, the need to offer comfort through touch, is not a modern luxury. It is a behavior that has existed for tens of thousands of years, a fundamental thread in the fabric of what makes us human. It was as crucial to our ancestors on the savannah as a sharp spear or a sturdy shelter. But if this is our ancient inheritance, what has become of it in our modern, hyper-rational world? In our contemporary society, which often prizes individualism and stoic self-reliance, the primal embrace persists. It remains a universal language that needs no translation. We see it in a parent rocking a feverish child through the night, their embrace a more potent medicine than any drug. We see it in the friend who wordlessly pulls another into a hug upon hearing tragic news, the solidity of their body offering a comfort words cannot. We see it in the hushed corridors of hospitals and the quiet moments of victory. The gesture is the same as it was for our ancestors, a pulling close, a sharing of warmth, a silent communication that says, "You are not alone." In a world increasingly mediated by screens and digital pings, this physical, emotional connection remains an irreducible need. It is a vestige of our biology that our technology cannot replicate or replace. It is a bridge between our complex modern selves and our ancient, biological core. We have built civilizations, but we still heal each other with a touch. Yet, to see the tear solely as a trigger for comfort is to only understand half of its power. The embrace comforts the one who is held, but the tear is a tool for the one who cries. This is not a signal of weakness. It is a biological replica of a child's ultimate strategy for survival. In the infant, who possesses no strength, no words, no ability to feed or protect itself, the tear is its first and most powerful weapon. It is a sound and a sight that cannot be ignored. It bypasses logic and speaks directly to the instinctual core of the caregiver. So, if the embrace is the answer, then the tear is the perfect question. A question evolution has hardwired us to need to answer. This realization shifts the entire narrative. It reframes the vulnerable, crying infant not as a passive recipient of care, but as an active participant in its own survival, employing a biological technology millions of years in the making. It makes one wonder, how exactly did this simple, salty droplet become so indispensable to the continuation of our species? What precise survival pressures sculpted a distress signal so potent that it could compel a mother to risk her own life for the source of the sound? In the deep, echoing silences of the ancient world, beneath canopies of unfamiliar stars, there were no hospitals, no cribs with soft, waiting blankets, no doctors with gentle, knowing hands. The air was filled with the sounds of the wild, the crackle of fire, the whisper of the wind through grass, the distant calls of predators and prey. And yet, amidst this vast, unforgiving theater of survival, a new sound emerged, one that would become the most primal and powerful signal of all: the cry of a human infant. It was a sound that cut through the noise of existence, a biological siren that could not, and would not, be ignored. A newborn human is a study in profound vulnerability. It cannot walk, cannot speak, cannot fight or flee. It arrives utterly defenseless, a soft-skinned creature in a world of hard edges and sharp teeth. Its only weapon is its voice. That first gasp of air is not just the beginning of breath, it is the loading of a survival mechanism honed over millennia. The subsequent wail is its first and most crucial act of defense. In those moments, the line between life and death was not drawn by a claw or a fang, but by the sheer, piercing urgency of a cry. And sometimes, the silent, glistening evidence of that struggle, tears, marked the fragile boundary of that line. This is not a signal of weakness, but one of exquisite evolutionary strategy. The infant's cry is a key that fits a lock deep within the human brain, specifically the brain of its caregiver. It triggers a cascade of neurobiology as complex as it is instantaneous. The sound waves hit the ear, travel along the nerve, and ignite the hypothalamus. This ancient brain region responds by flooding the system with oxytocin, the molecule of bonding and care. It is a potent chemical cocktail designed to override fatigue, distraction, even self-preservation. It sharpens focus, pricks the heart with a needle of anxiety, and compels an action-oriented response. The mother's body, often before her conscious mind even registers the sound, is already preparing to respond, to soothe, to feed, to protect. The child does not cry because it is weak. It cries because evolution has selectively favored those who knew how to call for help most effectively. Its survival is a social contract written in sound and chemistry, a promise that its need will be met by another's compulsion to give. We can find whispers of this ancient contract etched not in genes, but in stone and soil. Archaeology offers a silent, poignant testimony to the value placed on the smallest lives. The skeletal remains of infants from foraging societies are often found treated with a care that speaks volumes. They were not discarded. They were buried separately, sometimes painted with sacred red ochre, a pigment of life and blood, or carefully swaddled in the fur of animals, perhaps a final act of warmth and protection from a community that understood loss. In a world of relentless scarcity, where resources were thin and the margin for error was non-existent, the decision to invest in a new life was monumental. In such a context, a strong, persistent cry may have been the infant's primary audition for life itself. It was proof of lung capacity, of a fierce will to live, and perhaps a signal to the mother's subconscious that this was a life worth the immense cost of keeping. The silence of a too-quiet baby may have been the most tragic sound of all. This deep-seated programming did not vanish with the advent of agriculture or the rise of cities. It migrated with us. In our modern world of padded rooms and predictable meals, the infant's cry retains its ancient power. Parenting guides and pediatricians consistently advise new parents to respond to their baby's cries, to build a foundation of trust and security. This advice is not a modern cultural invention. It is the acknowledgement of 100,000-year-old wiring. Our discomfort, our rising stress, our inability to concentrate. When a baby cries in a public place, these are not signs of personal failure. They are the echoes of that old, action-oriented response. It is a natural alarm system, passed down through generations, reminding us that a vulnerable member of our tribe needs attention. Our technology has changed, but our biology remembers the savannah. Yet, the journey of tears does not end with infancy. As we grow, the reasons for our crying transform. We are no longer sustained solely by the milk of a mother. We are sustained by the bonds we form with others. We no longer cry just from hunger or cold, but from a different kind of ache, the ache of loss, the sharp sting of a broken heart, the slow burn of grief. The tears that once secured milk and warmth now water the memory of a loved one. They are the same salt water, but for a different kind of survival. This transformation begs a question that stretches back into the deep past of our species. Did those same tears that ensured physical survival for an infant also accompany our ancestors in their first moments of emotional loss? When a member of the tribe did not return from the hunt, when an elder passed away, leaving a silence where their stories used to be, did the community gather and weep? Did the tears that began as a signal for nourishment evolve into a ritual of connection, a shared language for a pain that had no words? And if the cry of an infant could compel a single heart to action, what power might the shared tears of a tribe have unlocked? Could this simple, salty overflow have been the very catalyst for a deeper, more profound connection, the birth of a conscious desire to ease another's pain, not because they are our own, but simply because they are? A single tear traces a path down a cheek, a silent signal in the noise of the world. Someone stops. They see the glistening track, the shimmer of sorrow that speaks a language older than words. They pause, their own rhythm interrupted, and then they step closer. This quiet convergence, this unspoken pact between the one who weeps and the one who witnesses, might be one of the most ancient and fundamental rituals of our species. It is not merely an observation, it is a response. In that fragile, watery bridge between two individuals, we might just be witnessing the very birth of compassion. Compassion, the profound ability to not only recognize but to times feel, times the distress of another, and to be moved to alleviate it, is not a default setting. It is not a simple, hardwired instinct like fear or hunger. It is something far more complex, a delicate architecture of the soul built over millennia. Its foundations are laid not in grand declarations, but in raw, unguarded emotional displays. And among these, the tear holds a place of singular power. It is our first banner, a flag of surrender to an inner storm that we hoist unknowingly, signaling a need for aid, for comfort, for connection. It is vulnerability made liquid, and in that vulnerability lies an irresistible summons. Biologically, the sight of tears is a key turning in a lock deep within our brains. Functional MRI scans reveal a fascinating dance of neural activity when we see another person cry. The anterior cingulate cortex and the insula, two regions intimately involved in processing our own pain and emotional states, light up with empathetic fire. It is as if our own neural circuitry for suffering is being borrowed, mirrored, to understand the plight of another. We don't just see their sadness. On some fundamental level, we times feel times it. This is not just cognitive understanding, it is a visceral, shared experience. From an evolutionary standpoint, this reaction is a masterpiece of social engineering. Tears, short-circuit indifference. They are a potent lever, a biological tool that promotes pro-social, helping behavior. In a world of scarce resources and constant threat, the cost of stopping to help another could be high. Tears evolved as a signal so honest, so costly to fake, that they became a credible plea, making that cost worth paying. They ensured that the vulnerable were not left behind, that the bonds of the tribe were strengthened not just by shared strength, but by shared weakness. This story is written not only in our genes but in the very bones of our ancestors. The archaeological record offers silent, stone-hard testimony to this ancient capacity for care. We find skeletons, like that of the Neanderthal man from Shanidar Cave, who lived for years with a crushing head injury and a withered arm, blind in one eye, and surely unable to contribute to the hunt or the defense of his group. Yet he lived, and he was buried with care. We find the remains of the elderly, their teeth worn to the gums, their bones etched with the severe arthritis of a long and difficult life. They were fed, they were protected, they were moved. These are not the remains of a species that merely survived. These are the records of a species that had already learned the art of tending. They did not just live, they times felt. The healed fractures and the honored elders whisper across the millennia of a community that saw a broken limb not just as a liability, but as a call to mend. Was it the sight of pain, the sound of a stifled cry, the silent plea in a companion's eyes that moved them to such acts of tenderness long before any law or scripture commanded it? This ancient reflex persists, channeled through the complex arteries of modern society. We have institutionalized the tear, weaponized it for good. Charitable campaigns and humanitarian aid organizations understand its power implicitly. They show us the faces of children streaked with dirt and tears, and they ask us not to think, but to feel. Cinema, that great cathedral of collective emotion, orchestrates our catharsis, guiding us through narratives designed to make our eyes well up in the dark, connecting us to characters of pure fiction in a very real, very physical way. A compelling advertisement for a charity is, in its essence, a sophisticated attempt to trigger that same ancient neural pathway to make us pause in the channel surfing of our lives and truly see the distress of another. We are still those same creatures who stop to look at a grieving tribesmate. The context has morphed from a firelit cave to a screen-lit living room, but the reflex remains. See the tear, feel the tug, and help. Yet, this beautiful, bonding mechanism carries within it the seed of a profound paradox. If tears evolved as a signal, a biological tool to elicit care, then are they purely a selfless expression of grief? Or are they, on some unconscious level, also a performance, a strategic, evolved display to ensure we are not the ones left behind on the trail? Is the act of crying a genuine, uncontrollable overflow of emotion, or is it the deepest, most ancient part of our social brain enacting a survival strategy? The tear that feels so authentic to us, that seems the very essence of our private sorrow made public, could it also be a calculated risk? A gamble on the compassion of others? This thought does not cheapen the emotion. It deepens its mystery. It intertwines the utterly sincere with the fundamentally utilitarian, leaving us to wonder where the genuine feeling ends and the evolved performance begins. We are left with a question that challenges the very purity of our empathy. If a tear can be both a true cry of the heart and a key to survival, then when we weep, are we truly alone? Perhaps the first evidence of this deep, ancient conflict between feeling and function is found not in a living face, but in the dust of the departed. The oldest known graves, dating back over 100,000 years, suggest a moment of staggering cognitive and emotional revolution. Here, in the deliberate act of burial, we see the fingerprints of a mind that could contemplate an absence, that felt a loss so profound it demanded ritual. The body was not abandoned to the elements or to scavengers. It was curated, placed in a fetal position, sometimes accompanied with tools or flowers. It speaks of a love that reached beyond the breath of life. One can almost hear the silence that must have followed the last shovelful of earth, a silence heavy with a new kind of pain. In that quiet, as the first community of mourners stood around that first mound of fresh soil, did they understand what they had done? They had created a place for memory. They had drawn a line between the living and the dead. And in drawing that line, they invented longing. So we must ask, in those first goodbyes, under a Paleolithic sun, did the tears that fell onto the raw earth water the seed of a new hope? Was the very first tear of grief also, somehow, the first prayer? A shallow pit, dug into the earth 100,000 years ago. The light of a Paleolithic day falls upon two figures nestled within the soil. One is an adult, their form curled. The other, an infant, tucked close. Their faces are turned toward one another, a final, silent conversation etched into the very posture of their bones. Is this merely a practical disposal, a way to keep scavengers from a camp? Or is it something else entirely, the first fragile evidence of a farewell, the initial aching punctuation in the story of human grief? This act, the deliberate interment of the dead, is one of humanity's great evolutionary thresholds. It is a silent scream against the void, a behavior that whispers of a mind that has traveled beyond the immediate. It suggests not just an understanding of death as a biological end, but the dawning of a profound and painful emotional consequence. We did not just comprehend loss, we began to times feel, we began to mourn. This was the moment we learned that a person could be gone from the world, yet remain, vivid and aching, within us. The grave became the first monument to this paradox, a physical anchor for a memory that refused to dissolve. Beneath the weight of this sorrow lies a biological blueprint, a map of pain written in the language of neurons and chemistry. There is no single dedicated neural circuit labeled grief. Instead, this profound ache hijacks the existing machinery of our being. The anterior cingulate cortex, a region that flares with the sharp sting of physical injury, lights up again with the phantom pain of separation. It is as if the body, in its primitive wisdom, cannot distinguish between a wound to the flesh and a wound to the soul. Both register as a fundamental threat, a tearing of one's fabric. And from this internal storm come tears. They are not the simple, reflexive tears that cleanse a dusty eye, but a complex alchemy of stress hormones and proteins. They are a physiological pressure valve, a signal of submission and vulnerability broadcast to the world. They are, in their silent, salty stream, a plea for comfort, a bid to maintain the social bonds that now feel so terrifyingly fragile. We cry, in part, to be held. We cry to say, without words, that a piece of us is missing. The archaeological record offers a gallery of these silent goodbyes. At Qafzeh in Israel, a child was laid to rest with the antlers of a fallow deer clasped in its arms, a final gift for a journey unseen. At Sungir in Russia, 2 children were buried head to head, adorned with thousands of meticulously crafted ivory beads that would have taken a community generations to produce a staggering investment of love and labor into the soil. In the Shanidar cave in Iraq, an elderly man, crippled and blind, was carefully buried upon a bed of flowers, whose pollen still tells his story millennia later. These are not the acts of creatures merely tidying up. This is curation. This is ritual. The red ochre painted on skin, the tools placed by a hand, the body arranged in a posture of sleep. Each gesture is a desperate, beautiful attempt to bridge the impossible gap. It is an effort to preserve the memory of the person, to grant them a sliver of continued existence in the land of the living through the stories these objects would evoke. The grave becomes a storybook written in bones and artifacts, and we, the heirs to this ancient ache, continue the ritual. Our modern world, for all its clinical distance, is still woven through with the threads of this primordial practice. We gather in quiet rooms, we play their favorite music, we tell stories that make us laugh through our tears. We carry their photographs in our wallets, tiny windows to a world that was. We weep at airports and hospital doorways, our tears a liquid testament to a connection that distance or death strains but cannot fully sever. These rituals are our own version of ochre and ivory beads. We cry, not because we believe the departed can hear us, but because we must. The tears are for us, a necessary exorcism and a preservation. They are the way we keep the other person within us, solid and real, even as they fade from the world. It is how we love what we can no longer touch. But this entire, profound edifice of grief rests upon a single, terrifying cognitive leap. To feel the searing pain of loss, one must first possess a deep, intuitive understanding of what it means for something to be gone forever. The tears, the graves, the offerings, they all point to a mind that can hold the concept of annihilation and feel its emotional weight. So, when did the spark of that understanding first catch fire in the darkness of the human mind? If a tear is the evidence of a feeling, what is the evidence of the knowledge that made that feeling possible? When did we first truly know what it means to lose? A dog whose pup is gone will howl into the night. A monkey who has lost a companion will shriek into the jungle canopy. Their calls are raw, immediate, a biological siren of distress. But only a human looks up at the silent, indifferent stars and weeps. This act is different. It is not just a sound of pain, but a silent conversation with absence itself. It is a recognition of a void that was once filled, a story interrupted, a future rewritten into a lesser version. This uniquely human sorrow is the price of a mind that can hold on to the past and project itself into a future. It is the birth pang of loss, not as a momentary state, but as a permanent, conscious ache. This sense of loss is far more than a simple subtraction of a physical presence. It is the haunting shape of an emptiness carved into the architecture of the mind, into the very fabric of memory. It begins not at the moment of departure, but at the moment we first learn to hold someone inside us. When the human brain developed the profound capacity to form and store detailed, emotional images of others, their smile, the sound of their laughter, the specific way they filled a room, it also gifted us the terrifying ability to feel their absence. To miss someone is to possess a mental photograph so vivid that its subject's non-existence becomes a cognitive dissonance the heart struggles to resolve. The ache is for the warmth that should be there, for the conversation that should be happening, for the hand that should be held. It is the mind, reaching out and finding nothing where something, someone, once was. This intricate neural dance of presence and absence is choreographed deep within the brain's most complex structures. The hippocampus, that seahorse-shaped curator of our lived experience, works in concert with the prefrontal cortex, the brain's brilliant strategist and fortune-teller. Together, they perform a cruel and beautiful magic trick. They allow us to time travel. We can be sitting in a quiet room and yet be simultaneously walking a beach from 10 years ago, hearing the echo of a voice that will never speak again. More profoundly, they allow us to project forward. We can imagine a birthday party next year, a graduation, a simple Sunday dinner, and with devastating clarity, see the empty chair at the table. Our grief, therefore, is not merely for the present moment of solitude. It is a unique and heavy sorrow for 1,000 lost futures, for all the conversations that will never be had, for the shared joys that will now be experienced alone. Is this advanced consciousness, then, a magnificent curse? A tool that allows us to build cathedrals of memory, only to force us to live as ghosts within their halls? Our ancient ancestors seem to have wrestled with this same profound ache, and their attempts to answer it are etched into the very bones of history. Archaeology offers silent, powerful testimony to this struggle. We find an ochre-stained Neanderthal burial, a body carefully placed in a fetal position, surrounded by tools and flowers. We discover the tattooed skin of Ötzi the Iceman, his markings perhaps a map not just of his world, but of his spirit, a way to carry his identity beyond death. We uncover graves where a mother is buried holding her child, or a warrior with his weapon at his side. These are not merely rituals, they are the first, brave symbols of defiance against nature's most final law. They are an attempt to bridge the chasm, to say, "You are gone from this world, but I will not let you be gone from my time's world." The carefully placed spear, the handful of grain, the beloved trinket, each is a word in a silent language of love and loss. And the tear that surely fell onto that freshly turned earth, was it not the first and most universal of these symbols? The body's own saltwater, an offering of pure, powerless feeling against the immense, uncaring tide of time. In our modern world, the context of loss has transformed, but its core experience remains a universal thread connecting all of humanity. The pain of losing a loved one is a country everyone, eventually, must visit. The rituals may differ: a solemn funeral under rain-drenched skies, a silent vigil illuminated by a smartphone's glow, the finality of a last text message left unread, the haunting act of listening to an old voicemail just to hear a voice that has been erased from the present tense. Yet, in each case, the brain is performing the same essential, heartbreaking function. It is conducting a final inventory. It is comparing the vast, detailed library of what times was times with the stark, empty shelf of what times is. The tear that forms is simply the overflow of this impossible calculation. It is the body's physical expression of a psychic truth: I had, and now I have not. It is the embodied proof of a love that outlasts its object. In our shared vulnerability, in this universal language of sorrow, do we find our deepest connection to every other human who has ever loved and therefore ever mourned. But this leaves us with a quiet, unsettling question that hangs in the air long after the tears have dried. Why is it that only humans seem to truly, deeply, times understand, times the concept of loss in all its terrible, future tense complexity? Other creatures feel separation, they feel distress, but do they feel the haunting, persistent ghost of times what might have been? The answer may lie in the very thing that defines us, Our tears, then, might be more than just a sign of sadness. They could be the inevitable tax levied by consciousness itself. They are the price of admission for a mind powerful enough to hold the past, anticipate the future, and tell a story about itself. We paid for our self-awareness with the certainty of our own ending, and for our deep love with the certainty of a someday grief. So, is the tear not just a drop of salt water, but a drop of condensed consciousness? A tangible measure of the burden that comes with knowing, truly knowing, that we and everyone we love are, ultimately, transient? And if this is the cost, what strange alchemy of the mind transforms this pain from a burden into the very thing that gives our existence its deepest meaning and resonance? We know we are alive. This is the simple biological truth of any creature drawing breath, but we alone know we will die. This is the profound and terrifying burden of our consciousness. It is a knowledge that sits not in the stomach, but in the soul, a constant, low hum beneath the symphony of our daily lives. And in the face of that unbearable truth, the brain, that magnificent and over-evolved organ, must find a release. It must find a way to weep for a future loss that only it can see. Perhaps, then, tears are not a sign of weakness, but the only logical, physiological response when a self-aware mind stares into the abyss of its own end. What is the cost of seeing so clearly? This awareness of self, of time's relentless arrow, of mortality, it is the double-edged sword of our species. It is the gift that allows us to build cathedrals and compose concertos, to love with a depth that anticipates absence. And it is the curse that forces us to mourn in advance, to feel the phantom pain of a future we can vividly imagine. Our imagination, the very engine of our progress, is also a factory of potential sorrow. It conjures scenarios of illness, of failure, of goodbye, and the emotional system, overloaded by these fictional yet felt tragedies, must find a pressure valve. Sometimes, that valve is a sigh. Sometimes, a scream. But often, it is a silent, saline trail down the cheek. Is the price of our creativity an equal measure of dread? Deep within the folded gray matter of our brains, behind our eyes, the prefrontal cortex acts as a master planner, a relentless time traveler. This region allows us to project ourselves forward, to simulate outcomes, to build intricate models of reality that haven't happened yet. It is what lets a hunter-gatherer plan for a winter months away, and it is what lets a modern human agonize over a presentation scheduled for next week. This magnificent tool of foresight is what lifted us from the mud, but it has a dark side. This same machinery forces us to live in a state of perpetual anticipation, to rehearse grief and regret for events that exist only as electrical impulses in our skull. The anxiety of a future threat can be as visceral as the panic of a present one. The body doesn't always know the difference. So when the simulation becomes too real, when the weight of 1,000 possible tomorrows becomes too heavy, the nervous system must perform an emergency dump. It triggers a cascade of hormones, a spike in stress chemicals, and then a release. Tears are this biological reset button, a physiological storm designed to wash the internal slate clean. But can a few drops of salt water truly calm the storm of a conscious mind? We can see this ancient struggle etched not in stone, but in ritual. It is no coincidence that our earliest societies, almost as soon as they became societies, began to craft religion, mythology, and elaborate burial rites. The discovery of a Neanderthal burial site stained with ochre pollen speaks volumes. It whispers of a creature that understood, never again. When our ancestors grasped the cold, hard concepts of death and impermanence, they were faced with a psychological crisis. The mind, armed with its new and terrifying knowledge, had to invent spiritual tools to soothe itself. Stories of an afterlife, of gods, of cycles of rebirth. These were the first mental balms. But perhaps before the first story was ever told, before the first grave was ever dug, there was a more fundamental response. Perhaps the first tool was not a hand axe, but a tear. The original ritual was a sob in the dark, a shared, wordless acknowledgement of a fear too big to name. Did our first gods emerge from the mist of our own crying? In the modern world, this ancient system operates on a new, complex landscape. Our tears are no longer just for the immediate pang of a stubbed toe or the present grief of a lost kin. We cry for anxieties that are abstract and vast. We weep over a diagnosis yet to be given, a job interview yet to be had, a political future yet to unfold. We shed future tears for losses that are statistical, potential, digital. These tears are a strange and unique phenomenon. They are not a reaction to a present stimulus, but to a fabricated one, a testament to the brain's powerful simulation software. They are the purest expression of our self-awareness, proof that we are creatures who live not just in the present, but in the shadow of all possible futures. What does it mean that we have learned to grieve for things that have never been? So, if tears are the tax we pay for consciousness, the inevitable byproduct of a brain that knows too much, they are also the currency we use to stay connected. We do not cry in a vacuum. A tear is a signal. It is a physical manifestation of an internal state that is too complex for words. In a world where everyone is carrying the invisible weight of their own foreseen sorrows, a visible tear is a moment of radical honesty. It is a silent plea that says, "My simulation has become too much. See my pain. Help me carry it." It is the human animal's way of showing its soft underbelly, not in submission, but in a profound act of trust, inviting the community to form a protective circle around a vulnerability that is, ultimately, universal. But if a single tear can be a bond that holds a tribe together, what happens when that signal is sent from the margins? What power does it hold when it comes from those who have nothing else to offer? The silence after the explosion is a world of its own. It's not an absence of sound, but a heavy, ringing pressure that pushes down on the chest. Dust, thick and chalky, coats the tongue and blurs the world into a monochrome haze of grays and browns. In the center of this shattered landscape, a soldier lies. His uniform is torn, the fabric dark and wet. He does not scream. He does not call for his mother or beg for a medic. His body is too focused on the simple, monumental task of drawing the next breath. Yet, from the corners of his eyes, a clarity emerges. Tears cut clean paths through the grime on his cheeks, tracing maps of vulnerability on a face trained for stoicism. He makes no sound, but the signal is sent, and from the haze, figures emerge. His comrades, who should be surging forward, turn back. They move toward the weakness, drawn by an invisible cord, a primal understanding that overrides the logic of the battlefield. The mission is survival, but whose? This instinct, written in salt and water, is far older than any field manual. In the harsh and unrelenting theater of early human existence, life was a precarious proposition. An individual was a fleeting spark, easily extinguished by predator, famine, or a simple misstep. Survival was not a solo endeavor, it was a collective project. The group was the cradle, the shield, the repository of knowledge and food. To be cast out was to be handed a death sentence. In such a world, every signal, every behavior, was honed by the relentless pressure of natural selection. Among the most powerful of these signals, one that required no language, no complex explanation, was the tear. It is a universal semaphore of need, a bonding signal that cuts through the noise of the world to whisper a single, urgent truth. I am still here, and I cannot do this alone. Asterisk. Biologically, this is not a passive event, but an active, almost strategic, form of communication. Human tears, particularly those born of emotional distress, are chemically distinct from the basal tears that lubricate the eye. They contain a cocktail of hormones and proteins, including a natural painkiller and stress hormones like leucine and kephalin, but their true power lies not in their composition for the one crying, but in their perception by the one who sees. The act of crying activates a prosocial response in others. Functional MRI studies show that the sight of tears dampens activity in the brain regions associated with aggression and threat assessment. A crying face is not read as a challenge, it is instinctively understood as a plea. It disarms, it elicits empathy and a powerful hardwired urge to offer comfort, to help, to protect. It is a defensive strategy woven into our very emotional fabric, a way of lowering the club and raising the white flag without saying a word. It transforms a potential adversary into an ally, a bystander into a rescuer. Is it any wonder that this silent signal could turn comrades back into the heart of danger? The archaeological record, though silent on the matter of tears themselves, whispers the logic of this behavior. The fossilized remnants of small, tight-knit hunter-gatherer bands tell a story of interdependence. A healed femur bone, for instance, is one of archaeology's most profound finds. It tells a story not of a swift death from a broken leg, but of weeks or months of recovery, of being carried, fed, and protected by the group. In such a context, emotional intelligence was as critical as physical strength. The individual who could skillfully navigate social bonds, who could elicit compassion and care, significantly increased their odds of survival. Showing weakness at the wrong moment could invite danger, but displaying vulnerability at the right moment through a cry of pain, a slump of defeat, the welling of tears could be a life-saving gambit. It was a non-verbal request for clemency, for a second chance. It said, "I am no threat. I submit. Let me stay." Asterisk. The group that heeded this signal strengthened its own cohesion, building a web of mutual obligation and care that made everyone within it more resilient. Was this the first covenant, sealed not in blood, but in tears? This ancient calculus of connection did not vanish with the advent of modern society. It merely found new stages upon which to play out. Our villages may now be global, our threats more psychological than predatory, but our fundamental need for belonging remains. In our personal relationships, the refusal to show vulnerability, the ironclad insistence on emotional invulnerability, often becomes the very wedge that drives connections apart. We speak of walls, but what are they, if not a refusal to send the signal? Conversely, we consistently rate those who dare to cry in moments of grief, overwhelming joy, or raw frustration as more authentic, more trustworthy, more human. Their tears are a testament to their investment. They are proof that the relationship matters enough to risk looking fragile. This dynamic scales up into our most complex institutions. In politics, a calculated tear can humanize a candidate, transforming them from a policy platform into a relatable person. In art, a performer's ability to access and display true emotion is what bridges the gap between audience and stage, creating a shared, cathartic experience. Even in the hardened world of military command or corporate leadership, a well-timed display of authentic emotion can galvanize loyalty more effectively than any speech. The tear remains, as it always was, a petition for the hearts of others. It is a currency of connection that modern life has not devalued. Yet, to see tears only as a request for help is to see only the surface of a deep, still pool. There is another, more complex shade to this signal. Sometimes, the tears that fall are not just for a wound received, but for a wrong committed. They are not a call for aid, but an admission of fault. Imagine that same ancient band. A valuable tool is broken. Trust is fractured. The culprit caught does not offer a sophisticated apology. Language may fail. Instead, their shoulders slump, their head bows, and their eyes glisten. This display of raw, unvarnished shame and regret is a primal confession. It is a non-verbal plea for forgiveness, an appeal to the social bond that their action has threatened. It signals remorse so profound that it bypasses the cognitive and speaks directly to the emotional core of the group. It is a promise, written in water, that the transgression came from a place of error, not malice. It is the body's way of saying, "I have harmed the web that holds me. I am sorry. Do not cast me out." Asterisk. This instinct to cry when we have done wrong suggests that tears are not merely a tool for survival, but perhaps the most ancient language of conscience itself. If a cry for help seeks to maintain a connection, then a cry of remorse seeks to repair one. It is a signal that the social contract, though breached, still matters deeply to the one who broke it. But then, we must ask, if tears can so effectively manipulate a social response, both to garner aid and to elicit forgiveness, where does the authentic emotion end and the performance begin? Can a reflex so fundamental to our bonding also be the ultimate tool of deception? And if so, does that make the tear any less powerful, or any less true. A single tear traces a path down a cheek, a silent streak against the skin. No sound accompanies it. No words are spoken to give it context or meaning. And yet, in that quiet descent, something profound shifts. A hardened expression softens. A wall of anger begins to crumble. An apology, however eloquent, can be dissected, doubted, or denied. But a tear, in its wordless vulnerability, often disarms us completely. It is a universal signal that bypasses the logic of language and speaks directly to something ancient within us. It is the body's most primal confession, an admission of fault, of regret, of a helplessness so deep that the only thing left to do is to silently break open. When language fails, or when it has been weaponized into lies, the body seeks a deeper, more honest form of expression. Tears are that language. They are not a choice in the way words are. They are an overflow. They are the physical evidence of an internal state that can no longer be contained by the neat, often deceptive, boxes of vocabulary. A shouted, "I'm sorry," can ring hollow. A defiant, "It wasn't my fault," can widen a rift. But a tear is a surrender. It is a white flag raised not by the conscious mind, but by the raw, unguarded self. It confesses to a truth that the ego might still be struggling to articulate. That we were wrong, that we are wounded, that we have caused wounding, and that in this moment we know of no other way to bridge the chasm we have created. Science has begun to map the powerful, almost alchemical, effect of this signal. Neuroimaging studies reveal that when we observe another person's tears, our brain does not simply register sadness. It engages in a complex evaluation of social cues. The sight of tears activates regions associated with empathy and compassion, but also those involved in assessing trust and sincerity. It triggers a response remarkably similar to witnessing a deliberate, submissive apology, a bowed head, open palms. The observer, often without any conscious thought, begins to perceive the crying individual as more genuine, their remorse more profound, and consequently, they become far more inclined to offer forgiveness. This is not merely a cultural nicety, it appears to be a hardwired behavioral adaptation. Biologists classify it as a reconciliation behavior, a tool for social repair encoded into our very biology from a time when exile from the tribe was a death sentence. The tear, therefore, is not just saltwater and emotion, it is an instinctual survival mechanism, a non-verbal plea to be let back in. If we could journey back through the layers of time, to the flickering torchlight of ancient caves, what evidence would we find? The famous paintings depict the necessities of life, great beasts hunted, powerful rituals performed. But look closer. Among the charging bison and the proud hunters, there are other, quieter figures. A silhouette kneeling, head bowed low to the earth, an image of a figure offering something to another, posture bent in submission. While the pigments used could never capture a transparent tear, the postures they immortalized speak of a profound emotional vocabulary. If tears were present in these moments, and it is a compelling thought that they were, then they were never a private indulgence. They were a public utility, a crucial part of a ritualized performance of remorse and reconciliation. They were the necessary conduit for an individual's return to the fold, the visible proof of a contrition that allowed the social fabric, so vital to survival, to be mended. In the deep past, a tear was not weakness. It was a tool for rebuilding the community. This ancient currency of connection has not lost its value in our modern world. It has simply found new arenas. We see its power in the most heightened human dramas. In a hushed courtroom, a defendant's stoic facade finally cracks, and a single tear can sway the opinion of a jury more effectively than a final, rehearsed plea. In a quiet restaurant, a person gets down on one knee, and the glistening eyes that meet the proposal ring speak of a joy too immense for words, sealing a pact more binding than any signature. A teenager, after a furious argument, finally mutters an apology to a parent, their voice thick with emotion and their eyes shining. That tear is the final, truthful punctuation that makes the words believable. It remains the last-ditch ticket to salvaging a relationship on the brink, the ultimate argument when all other arguments have failed. But this powerful tool, this instinctual language, is it distributed equally? The stereotype, of course, is that tears are the domain of women, a sign of their emotionality, often wielded as a manipulative weapon. But what if this modern perception obscures a far deeper, older truth? What if the propensity for emotional tears was not a liability, but an evolutionary asset intricately linked to the very cradle of humanity? In a world where the central, most vital social unit was the mother-child bond, what role did tears play? A baby's cry is a survival siren, an irresistible command to attend to its needs. Could an adult's emotional tear be an echo of that primal signal, a nonverbal cry for reconnection that was honed and valued in a social world where the nurturing, community-preserving instincts often associated with femininity were, in fact, the central organizing principle? Was the tear, therefore, not a sign of weakness, but one of the original instruments of social cohesion, a skill as critical to the survival of the tribe as the strength to wield a club? And if that is so, a question naturally forms in the silence that follows a tear's fall. It pushes us back even further, beyond the dawn of our own species, to ponder those who walked the earth before us. They too lived in social groups, cared for their injured, and buried their dead with what appears to be reverence. Did they, too, feel a rafters in their baskets of groth? Sorrow so deep it could only be expressed by a slow, silent tear tracing a path through the dust on their cheeks? They were not us. Their brow ridges were heavy, their frames stout, built for the brutal winters of a Pleistocene Europe. They were Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, and in the cold, dark recesses of a cave in Shanidar, in what is now Iraq, one of them carefully laid another to rest. The body was placed in a shallow pit, perhaps on a bed of gathered plants. Pollen found tens of millennia later would tell a story of flowers, yarrow, groundsel, horsetail, and grape hyacinth clustered around the remains. This was not a discard. This was a deposition. It speaks of a ritual, a care that extends beyond the needs of the living. We, Homo sapiens, with our unparalleled cognitive arrogance, have long considered the profound ache of grief, the hot spill of tears, to be ours alone. But if they knew how to bury, might they also have known how to mourn? Could a being so like us in body, and seemingly in deed, have also known the unique sorrow that gives rise to tears? The Neanderthals were not our direct ancestors. They were more like cousins, a separate branch on the tangled human family tree that flourished in Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before fading into our shadow. Their story is not a prelude to ours, but a parallel narrative, one that ended abruptly. Yet, in that parallel narrative, we find echoes of behaviors we consider fundamentally human, the very bedrock of our emotional consciousness. They crafted complex tools, mastered fire, hunted massive game, and seemingly tended for their weak. They did this not as crude prototypes, but as contemporaries, and in many cases, they did it before we ever did. The evidence etched into the earth and their bones suggests that the emotional landscape we claim as our exclusive domain, compassion, love, loss, might have been a territory they walked as well. What does it mean for our self-conception if the things we hold most sacred about our humanity were not ours to invent? Biologically, the potential was certainly there. The Neanderthal brain was, on average, slightly larger than our own, while its shape was different, elongated like a football, rather than globular like our soccer ball. The key neurological hardware for processing deep emotion was remarkably similar. MRI scans of endocasts, digital impressions taken from the inside of fossil skulls, show the familiar structures of an amygdala, that almond-shaped hub of fear and memory, and an insula critical for social emotions like empathy and disgust. Their limbic system, the ancient core of feeling shared by all mammals, was virtually identical to ours. This is not just the architecture for a flight or fight response. This is the intricate wiring for attachment, for the complex social bonding that defines primate groups. It is the neural circuitry that allows a mother's face to ignite a spark of joy, or the absence of a companion to leave a cold, neural void. If the same hardware produces the same software in us, is it not the height of arrogance to assume their internal world was any less vivid, any less fraught with feeling? The raw biological capacity for sorrow, and perhaps for the physical expression of it, was present in that large, complex brain. The question is not times if times they could feel, but what the quality of that feeling was, and how it might have manifested in a world so different from our own. The archaeology provides the scenes, though the script must be inferred. The Shanidar Cave is perhaps the most poignant chapter. The famous flower burial of Shanidar IV, while debated, persists in the imagination because it satisfies a deep need in us to see them as kindred spirits. It suggests an aesthetic choice, a symbolic offering things we associate with the tenderness of grief. But even if the pollen was carried by burrowing rodents, as some argue, other finds are incontrovertible. At the same site, Shanidar I, an individual known as Nandi, tells a story of compassion. He lived to a relatively old age, despite a crushing blow to his head that likely blinded him in one eye, a withered and amputated right arm, and a host of other degenerative ailments. His survival for years after these injuries is a silent testament to a society that cared for its vulnerable. He could not have hunted or contributed in conventional ways. His value was not utilitarian, it was social. He was fed, protected, and kept clean by others. This is not the action of a species driven solely by cold pragmatism. It is evidence of empathy, of a shared identity that values life beyond its immediate function. And where there is such deep empathy in life, does it not naturally follow that its loss would be met with a profound sense of absence? The care for a living body and the ritualized care for a dead one may be two sides of the same emotional coin. This growing body of evidence begins to crack the anthropocentric pedestal upon which we've placed ourselves. For centuries, Western thought has positioned times, Homo sapiens times, as the sole vessel of deep emotion, the lonely possessors of a rich inner life, crowned by a divine spark. The Neanderthals, when they were considered at all, were brutish and dull, doomed because they lacked our intellectual and emotional fire. But the stones and bones tell a different story. They suggest that tears, or the internal state they represent, may not be a human invention at all. Instead, they might be an evolutionary tool, a deeply ancient adaptation that emerged in a common ancestor, a shared response to the universal realities of social bonding, loss, and pain. We did not create sorrow, we inherited it, and in inheriting it, we may share it with ghosts. What becomes of our human exceptionalism when we realize that our most intimate emotions might be a common inheritance, a legacy from lost cousins we once thought beneath us? So, did a Neanderthal ever cry? We will never find a fossilized tear. Emotion does not fossilize, but we find the echoes of actions that, in us, are almost invariably driven by powerful emotion. We find care, we find ritual, we find community. It is a compelling, though tentative, observation that the capacity for grief and its physical expression is far older and more widespread than we ever imagined. Their tears would have been the same salt and water as ours, sprung from the same deep well of evolutionary need. They were a different kind of human, but they were human nonetheless, navigating a world of ice and giants, of love and loss. Their silence in the fossil record is not an emptiness, but a presence we are only just learning to hear. If their sorrow left a mark, perhaps it is not in the ground, but in the very fact of our shared biology, a ghostly imprint on the emotional template of every human born since. And if we accept that they too knew how to weep for what was lost, then what does that say about the solitary weight of our own tears? In a world where softness is so often mistaken for weakness, where the sharp edges of ambition and force are prized above all, consider for a moment the quiet, subversive power of a tear. It is a small thing, a mere drop of salt and water, yet it can halt wars, disarm anger, and command the most primal form of attention. What if, in the deep, shadowed corridors of our prehistory, this wasn't a sign of vulnerability at all, but one of the most sophisticated tools of power ever evolved? And what if that power belonged, first and foremost, to the mother? Imagine the scene. It is not the dramatic, blood-soaked imagery we often associate with early humanity, the triumphant hunter with his kill. Instead, picture the constant, unending background hum of survival, a small band of humans, huddled against the elements, against predators, against the sheer, crushing weight of an indifferent world. In this reality, the act of giving life was only the first, most obvious step. The true test the relentless marathon, was in keeping that life alive. This duty fell, overwhelmingly, to the mothers. Theirs was a dominion not of the spear's reach, but of the hearth's radius, not of the fatal blow, but of the sustaining bond. Their currency was not violence, but emotion, and one of their most potent currencies may have been the ability to cry. This is not a sentimental fancy. It is written in our very biology, a subtle script of hormones and evolutionary strategy. Prolactin, a hormone present in all humans but found in significantly higher concentrations in women, serves a dual purpose. It stimulates milk production, the literal nourishment of life, but it also primes the body for a heightened emotional response. It makes the tear ducts more responsive, the heart more readily stirred by the cry of an infant or the sight of a struggling child. To label this sensitivity as weakness is to profoundly misread nature's design. This was a strategic adaptation, honed over millennia. The mother who felt more deeply, who was wired to respond with a flood of empathetic urgency to distress, was the one who would be most vigilant, most protective, most attuned to the subtle shifts in her child's well-being. Her tears were not a leakage of strength. They were the visible signal of a profound connection, an alarm system that operated on the frequency of love. Was this emotional capacity, then, the true cradle of human cooperation? The silent stones of archaeology seem to whisper a confirmation. Long before kings were entombed with their gold or warriors with their swords, we find the graves of women cradling children, their skeletons telling a story of a final, eternal embrace. We unearth figurines, the Venus of Willendorf, the goddess of Çatalhöyük, voluptuous, powerful, elemental. They are not depicted with weapons of hunt or war, but with the abundant curves of life-givers, the serene authority of nurturers. These artifacts suggest a central, revered role for the feminine principle, one rooted in creation and sustenance. In these early societies, the glue that held the group together was likely not just shared genes, but shared feeling. And who was the chief architect of this emotional landscape? If anyone was the first to weep at a loss, to express a grief so profound it forged a new, collective understanding of mortality and love within the tribe, the evidence points to her. Did her tears, in their falling, help teach us what it meant to be human? This ancient legacy casts a long, complex shadow into our modern world. Today, the statistics are clear. Women cry more frequently than men. This disparity is often dismissed, sometimes even weaponized as proof of a lesser emotional fortitude. But seen through this deeper, evolutionary lens, it looks strikingly different. The greater cultural permission granted to women to express emotion, particularly through tears, feels less like a condescending allowance and more like the faint, lingering echo of a time when this expression was not just personal, but profoundly functional. It was a vital form of social communication, a tool for maintaining the group's cohesion. The woman who wept was not falling apart. She was knitting the social fabric more tightly together, signaling distress, eliciting comfort, reinforcing the bonds of care that allowed the tribe to survive. She was not just feeding the bodies of her children. She was, in a very real sense, feeding the emotional heart of the entire community. So when we see a woman's tears now, are we witnessing a holdover of a primal power we've simply forgotten how to read? This line of thought inevitably spirals outward, forcing a question that hangs in the air, challenging the quiet of our assumptions. If the ability to cry was once a tool of power, a strategic biological adaptation that helped secure the survival of the next generation and the cohesion of the tribe, then what of the other half of humanity? The question lingers, a quiet challenge to the narrative we've built about strength and stoicism. But if women were permitted this potent emotional language, this hydraulic release of feeling that could command attention and nurture bonds, then what of men? Is their historical silence, their learned restraint from tears, a natural state, or was it too a constructed role? Could it be that they also once held this permission, this key to a fuller emotional spectrum, and somewhere on the long march toward civilization, it was taken from them? The evidence for that is written not in stone, but in the body itself, in the very chemistry of emotion. For the difference in tears is not just cultural, it is profoundly hormonal. What secret power, then, lies dormant in a single tear, waiting for its chemistry to be unlocked? A strange and simple fact: women cry, on average, 3 to 4 times more than men. It's a statistic that seems to whisper of fragility, a biological verdict on emotional resilience. But to hear it that way is to misunderstand the story entirely. This is not a story of weakness, but one of profound chemical difference. It is a tale written not in the heart, but in the intricate, swirling currents of our hormones. A silent, powerful language that scripts our most human expressions in ways we are only beginning to comprehend. Tears are never just water. They are a complex saline solution, a biological release valve for a pressure cooker of feeling. But emotional tears, those that spring from grief, frustration, overwhelming joy, or profound connection, are a different alchemy altogether. They are a cocktail of stress hormones and proteins, a literal pouring out of an internal state, and the master chemists behind this brew are molecules like prolactin and testosterone. Prolactin, famously known for its role in milk production, is also a key regulator of the body's fluid systems and, intriguingly, is found in significantly higher concentrations in women. It is as if the body that can nurture with one fluid is also more readily equipped to release emotion with another. Testosterone, on the other hand, seems to act as a dam. Studies suggest it has an inhibitory effect on crying, a hormonal suppressant of this very specific emotional overflow. So, from the very beginning, the playing field is not level. It is a landscape shaped by different chemical weathers. A woman's biology might whisper, "Let it go," while a man's might murmur, "Hold it in." Is this then a predestined fate, a hormonal hand one is simply dealt? To believe so would be to ignore the second act of this story, written not in our blood but in our bones, the deep archaeological layers of our shared human past. If biology were the sole author, we would expect to see this crying disparity etched uniformly across time and culture. But the historical record suggests a more nuanced script. In many early matrilineal societies or nomadic bands, where survival depended on tight-knit communal cohesion and expressiveness was a vital social glue, emotional display was not so rigidly gendered. A man's tears could be a sign of empathy, a testament to a lost bond, a valid and valuable social signal. The capacity for emotional expression, including crying, was a human tool, not a gendered one. The shift came with the tectonic movements of society itself, the rise of stratification, property, and organized warfare. When the world became a place of conquest and defense, a new ideal for masculinity was forged in the fire, one of stoicism, physical endurance, and emotional control. To be a protector, a warrior, one could not afford to be perceived as vulnerable. The tears that once signified connection now risked signaling instability. Could it be that the stiff upper lip is not a biological imperative, but a cultural artifact, painstakingly carved over centuries? This artifact is now the air we breathe, the invisible pressure that shapes modern social life. For men today, the mandate, "Don't cry," is a powerful, often unspoken rule. It's in the well-meaning advice given to a young boy who falls, "Big boys don't cry," a phrase that teaches him to divorce his external stoicism from his internal pain. It's in the portrayal of male heroes in film and literature, whose vulnerability is a fleeting moment quickly buried beneath action or anger. This creates a profound rupture, a dissonance between our evolutionary emotional hardware and our cultural software. Biologically, men possess the same tear ducts, the same neural pathways for emotional pain, the same capacity for overwhelming feeling. Their bodies are equipped for the storm, but their culture has forbidden the rain. They feel the pressure build, yet the release valve is socially welded shut. So what happens to that unshed water? Does it retreat inward, pooling in the hidden reservoirs of the body and mind, expressing itself as heightened stress, unexplained anger, or a quiet, persistent numbness? If tears are a language, then we have systematically silenced half the population, forcing them to speak a dialect of emotional restraint. What is the cost of translating a sob into a silence? So, we arrive at the quiet, aching heart of the matter. The question is no longer times why women cry more, but something far more profound and concerning. What happens when a man is not permitted to cry? We have explored the hormonal landscape that makes crying more accessible to women, and we have traced the cultural history that made it less acceptable for men. But this is not merely a social curiosity, it is a potential neurological crisis. Crying is not just an expression of emotion, it is a regulatory process. Emotional tears contain stress hormones like adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, and leucine and enkephalin, a natural painkiller, suggesting that the act of crying is literally the body's way of purging itself of excess stress chemicals. It is a primal, physiological reset button. If that button is rendered off limits for an entire gender, are we not effectively forcing them to endure toxic levels of emotional stress without one of the body's most fundamental release mechanisms? Are we asking the male brain to metabolize sorrow and overwhelm entirely internally without the cathartic, chemical exhalation that evolution provided? The silence that follows a man's suppressed cry is not empty. It is full of everything left unsaid, every unshed tear that remains trapped within, a tidal wave of feeling contained by a wall of expectation. We began with a simple disparity and found a deep rift between our biology and our culture. We have seen how hormones nudge us and how history shoves us. But the final, lingering image is not of a statistic, but of a single, held-back tear. It represents a biological impulse thwarted by a social command, a human need denied by a human rule. The tear yearns to fall, to carry its load of pain out into the world. The world tells it to stay. This is the silent struggle, the invisible burden. So if tears are the body's own language for pain, what does it say when an entire half of humanity is taught to speak in a foreign tongue of restraint? The words hang in the air, a cultural edict passed down through generations. Men don't cry. It's a simple phrase, often uttered with a clap on the back or a stern look, meant to forge resilience. But what if this well-intentioned mantra has cost us something far more critical? What if, in our quest to build stoic fortresses, we have asked men to sever a fundamental biological instinct, to silence a primal language of the body that speaks when words fail? This isn't just about social norms. It's a quiet amputation of a vital human function, a rejection of a tool for survival that evolution itself provided. The story begins not in the heart, but in the intricate wiring of the brain. Neuroscience reveals a truth that culture often obscures. The neural architecture for processing emotion, the amygdala's alarm, the hippocampus's memory, the prefrontal cortex's regulation is remarkably similar between men and women. The hardware for profound feeling is a universal human inheritance. The difference, then, is not in the capacity to feel, but in the permission to express. Society installs a different software. While a young girl's tears might be met with comfort and a whispered, "Let it out," a young boy's are too often met with a command, "Shake it off, be a man." Boys don't cry. The emotion arrives with the same electric intensity, the same chemical surge, but where does it go when the exit is boarded up? It turns inward. The body, this brilliant and unforgiving machine, must deal with the unresolved storm. When emotional pain is met not with release but with suppression, the stress response doesn't simply vanish. It simmers. The adrenal glands continue to pump cortisol, the primary stress hormone, into the bloodstream. Without the cathartic pressure valve of tears, this cortisol lingers, fostering a state of chronic, low-grade alarm. This is the silent, physiological battle waged inside. A man who doesn't cry isn't necessarily a man who doesn't feel. He is often a man engaged in an exhausting civil war, his brain fighting against his own hormones and the cultural rules that demand their containment. Is resilience truly the absence of struggle, or the ability to process it completely? If we dig deeper into the archaeological layers of our collective past, we find that this rigid emotional embargo is a relatively modern construct. Ancient models of manhood were not universally devoid of public emotion. In many warrior cultures, tears were not a sign of weakness, but of depth. They were the expected accompaniment to rites of passage, a recognition of the heavy weight of responsibility being shouldered. They flowed freely in rituals of mourning, a communal release that bonded the tribe together in shared grief. They might have been shed before a great battle, not from fear, but from a profound connection to the life that might be lost one's own, and one's brothers. In these contexts, tears were not a gendered privilege, but an emotional survival tactic, a necessary saltwater release that allowed for the psychological endurance required to face the next day. When did we decide that to be a protector, one must first become numb? The modern social landscape is littered with the consequences of this numbness. The mandate of Stoicism creates islands of isolation where men float alone on seas of unspoken anxiety, grief, and frustration. This emotional isolation is a primary fertilizer for depression, for a simmering internal violence that has no healthy outlet. It manifests in the clenched jaw, the withdrawn silence, the inexplicable anger that seems to erupt from nowhere. We have forgotten an older, more integrated wisdom. From the tribal elder to the legendary leader, a tear was once seen not as a crack in the armor, but as a proof of a soul beneath it, a sign that one cared deeply enough to be moved. It was a testament to a heart that had not yet turned to stone. What is the true cost of a dryness we have been conditioned to prize? But the story doesn't end with simple repression. Culture is a cunning alchemist. It doesn't just suppress natural expressions, it often appropriates and transforms them, draining them of their authentic meaning to serve a new purpose. So while it tells the everyday man to swallow his tears, it simultaneously elevates them to a powerful symbol elsewhere. It allows them to be shed on grand stages, in curated moments, for specific effects. The tears of a politician at a memorial, of a hero in a blockbuster film, of a saint in a religious icon, these are not just accepted, they are potent tools. This creates a strange dissonance. The very same biological act that is shamed in private is celebrated as a symbol of ultimate truth and humanity in public. If a tear is the body's purest, most unscripted language, what happens when it is handed a script? Perhaps the question is no longer whether men have tears, but who gets to control their meaning. We see the answer not in the living room, but on the screen and in the stone. We see it in the weathered marble of a weeping saint, whose carved tears are meant to signify divine compassion and a connection to human suffering. We see it in the carefully framed close-up of a celebrity's glistening cheek on a news broadcast, a tear presented as undeniable proof of their authenticity, their realness. The tear is taken from the realm of the personal and physiological and placed into the realm of the symbolic, becoming a currency of persuasion and a weapon of narrative. It is no longer a release, it is a performance. It is no longer a quiet surrender to feeling, it is a loud statement. When a tear is used to prove a point, can it still be true? A single tear traces a path down a cheek. It is a universal signal, a silent language understood across cultures and millennia. We see it and we feel a pull, an instinctual urge to console, to understand, to connect. But what if that tear was not born from a wellspring of private grief? What if it was shed, consciously or not, for an audience? There are those who do not cry from pain alone, but because they know another is watching. And that single, performed tear can hold a power far beyond the solitary sob. It can sway a jury, topple a government, or open the wallets of millions. It is no longer just a reflex. It has become a symbol, a tool of communication, and a form of subtle, potent power. From the sacred texts of ancient religions to the polished stages of modern politics, humanity has learned to wield tears not just as an expression of feeling, but as a sophisticated social and emotional code. We have learned to use them. A televised apology feels more sincere with a glistening eye. A charity campaign gains urgency with a heartfelt crack in a spokesperson's voice. A leader's tear can signal shared sacrifice, forging an instant bond with the masses. This is the theater of emotion, and its most powerful prop is the tear. It is a currency of trust, exchanged in the marketplace of human connection. This power is not merely a social construct. It is etched into our very biology. When we see a tear, whether genuine or a masterful act, our brains do not pause to authenticate it. They respond. Neuroscientists have observed that the sight of tears triggers a cascade of neural activity associated with empathy and compassion. They contain chemical signals, a subtle cocktail of proteins that, when inhaled, can actually lower testosterone levels in men and reduce aggression. It is a primal, unconscious call for peace. Our evolutionary history has not equipped us with a reliable tear detector. For our ancient ancestors, the cost of ignoring a genuine signal of distress was far greater than the cost of being occasionally duped. So, our default setting is to believe. We are hardwired to lower our defenses, to trust, to lean in when we see that glimmer of moisture. The line between the authentic and the performed is, in that primal moment of connection, utterly irrelevant to our instinctual selves. This deep-seated wiring is echoed in the silent stones of our past. Long before neuroscience, our ancestors were grappling with the potent symbolism of the crying figure. In the dim light of tombs and temples, we find them. Stone gods with trails of polished obsidian for tears, funerary statues with faces forever streaked in grief. The ancient Egyptians believed the tears of the god Osiris fertilized the Nile, giving life to the entire kingdom. In Greece, professional mourners, the times mulieres praeficae, were hired to perform elaborate tearful laments, their displayed grief a necessary conduit to honor the dead and appease the gods. These artifacts and rituals suggest a profound early understanding. The one who cried was not merely sad, they were a bridge. Their tears were a visible connection to the invisible world, a show of emotion so powerful it could commune with deities, bless a harvest, or safely guide a soul to the afterlife. To weep was to tap into a sacred, supernatural force. This ancient performance has found its modern amphitheater. Today, the stage is global, and bathed in the glow of high-definition screens. We are all now the audience. A politician's voice breaks during a concession speech, and their approval ratings soften. An actor accepts an award, their tearful gratitude feeling more real than any rehearsed line. An influencer shares a vulnerable moment on camera, their tears building a brand of authenticity that translates into loyalty and sales. The tear has become the ultimate emotional shortcut, a piece of instant, visceral communication in a world saturated with words. It cuts through the noise. But in this age of perpetual performance, a quiet question lingers just beneath the surface of every public display. Is it real? Has the symbol begun to eclipse the substance it was meant to represent? And if we can so effectively simulate a tear, have we, in some fundamental way, lost touch with the primal emotional instinct it was meant to express? Or are we not losing anything at all, but simply evolving, learning to use this ancient, powerful tool for the complex social landscape we now inhabit? Perhaps the performance itself is a new, intricate form of authenticity, a language we are all learning to speak, for better or worse. Yet, for all its power to connect and command, this very act is often met with averted eyes and uncomfortable silence in our daily lives. If evolution gifted us tears to bind us together, why do so many now hide them, swallowing that salty taste of vulnerability? What makes us forget that this once sacred signal, this bridge between worlds, was the very thing that saved us from the terrifying silence of isolation? A single tear, tracing a path down a weathered cheek in a crowded subway car, can silence the entire compartment. But the silence that follows is rarely one of shared understanding. It is a thick, uncomfortable quiet, punctuated by averted gazes and the subtle shifting of bodies away from the source. The message is clear, a social edict whispered not in words but in action. This is not the place for that. Here, in the modern world, the act of crying, a biological response as ancient as our species, has become a transgression. We have taken a fundamental human language, one written in saltwater and shuddering breaths, and branded it a sign of weakness, a public failure of composure. It is a profound paradox. Evolution, that meticulous and unsentimental sculptor, gifted us tears for a reason. They are not a flaw in our design, but a feature of our incredible social complexity. From a purely biological standpoint, tears are a tool of connection. They are a signal our autonomic nervous system broadcasts when the weight of an emotion, be it grief, frustration, overwhelming joy, or physical pain, becomes too much for the body to contain silently. This system, the ancient core of our being, does not comprehend boardrooms, polite company, or social media feeds. It does not check for an appropriate time and place. It simply reacts. A surge of cortisol, a racing heart, a tightening in the throat, the cascade is automatic. The tear duct is merely the spillway for a reservoir that has overflowed. And yet, modern society demands that we build a dam against this very flood. We are asked to compartmentalize, to schedule our grief for private moments that often never come, creating a constant, low-grade war between the primal self and the polished persona we are required to wear. This dissonance between our biological inheritance and our cultural expectations is a relatively new chapter in the human story. If we could peel back the layers of time, we would find a very different relationship with tears. In many ancient and traditional societies, collective crying was not just accepted, it was ritualized, formalized, given a sacred space to exist. There were professional mourners whose job was to lead communities in shared lamentation, their tears giving permission and voice to the grief of all. In farewells, in victory, in the terrifying and glorious act of childbirth, tears flowed freely. They were a communal solvent, dissolving individual isolation and reforging the bonds of the tribe. A man's tears were a sign of depth of feeling, not a lack of fortitude. In those times, to weep was to participate fully in the human experience, to communicate a truth that words could never fully capture. The tear was a testament, a proof of feeling, welcomed by the community. Somewhere on the path to the present, we lost this collective vocabulary. The industrial age, with its demand for clockwork efficiency, and the modern corporate world, with its cult of relentless optimism and unflappable professionalism, systematically exiled strong emotion from the public sphere. The workplace, a realm of logic and productivity, has particularly low tolerance for the body's emotional leaks. A tear shed at a desk is too often met not with concern but with a label: unprofessional, unstable, unable to handle pressure. We are taught to apologize for our tears, to wipe them away hurriedly with a muttered excuse about stress or tiredness, as if expressing the very stress we feel is the greater crime. This enforced stoicism comes at a cost that science is only beginning to quantify. Studies suggest that chronically suppressing emotional tears, clamping down on that autonomic nervous system response, can lead to increased anxiety, a weakened immune system, and a higher susceptibility to stress-related illnesses. The body, forced to contain the storm, begins to weather from the inside out. So where does this leave us? If society has so effectively demonized the public tear, if we have been taught from childhood to swallow our sobs and hide our red-rimmed eyes, why does the impulse remain so stubbornly, powerfully intact? Why? Despite every social injunction, does a broken heart still find its first and most honest expression in a flood of tears that we cannot, even if we wanted to, stop? Perhaps it is because love itself, in its rawest, most vulnerable forms, operates outside the rules we have constructed for everything else. It is the one domain where the dam is still permitted to break. The loss of a loved one, the shattering of a relationship, the overwhelming wave of gratitude for someone's existence, these experiences bypass our social programming and speak directly to that ancient biological core. In these moments, the tear is not a sign of weakness, but the absolute signature of our capacity to care. It is the body's unvarnished, unedited review of a profound event. The world may look away, but the truth of the feeling is written on the face for anyone brave enough to see it. And if love and loss can trigger this same complex response, this same release of salt and water and sound, what does that say about the strange alchemy of the human heart? Is the line between profound joy and profound sorrow, in the end, just a tear's breadth apart? Some people only cry after the goodbye is final, the last box packed, the door closed for good. Others find their eyes welling up in the very first moment of connection, in the quiet awe of a first kiss. It seems a paradox, this spectrum of sorrow and joy. Why does love, the very thing we chase for happiness, so reliably pull tears from us? It is not a simple question of pain. These are not merely the tears of a stubbed toe or a sharp cut. The tears of love are something else entirely, a complex, ancient language spoken by the body when the heart has been stretched far beyond its everyday vocabulary. They are the overflow, the necessary release when the intensity of feeling, whether ecstatic or devastating, threatens to overwhelm the fragile vessel of the self. all within the profound and terrifying state of deep connection with another. We often think of tears as a sign of weakness, a breakdown, but to see them only as failure is to miss their profound biological purpose. They are, in fact, a masterful act of regulation, a physiological release valve for an emotional system running at full capacity. When we fall in love, our internal chemistry is hijacked. The brain's reward centers flood with dopamine, painting the world in brighter colors and making every interaction with the beloved feel like a winning spin on a cosmic slot machine. Oxytocin, the so-called cuddle hormone, weaves a neural bond, creating a sense of deep, calming attachment and safety. This is a potent, exhilarating cocktail. But what happens when this intense connection is severed, either by the shock of loss or even by the sheer, staggering weight of its presence? The system goes into shock. The sudden absence of these neurochemicals creates a biological vacuum, a literal state of withdrawal not unlike that from a powerful drug. The body, confused and aching for what it has learned to rely on, seeks equilibrium. It cries. The act of crying does more than just express sadness. It actually releases stress hormones and endorphins, a built-in, ancient mechanism to self-soothe and begin the arduous process of recalibration. So, are the tears of a breakup merely grief, or are they the first, instinctive medicine our body administers to heal a neurological wound? Is the weeping after a first kiss not also a biological surrender, a response to a happiness so intense it registers in the body as a kind of beautiful shock? To understand the depth of this reaction, we must dig deeper than our own biology into the archaeological layers of our shared past. For our earliest ancestors, love was not a weekend luxury or a poetic abstraction. It was a fundamental survival strategy. Pair bonding meant a better chance of protecting offspring, sharing resources, and defending against a hostile world. In this context, a deep attachment was not about fleeting emotion, but about mutual perpetuation of life, of genes, of the tribe itself. The pain of separation would have been catastrophic, a threat to the very architecture of survival. Tears, in this light, emerge not as a sign of fragility, but as a powerful signal. They are a non-verbal testament to the irreplaceable value of the other. They signal to the group that a vital bond has been fractured, and perhaps they signal to the lost beloved a depth of commitment that words could never convey. The tears poured out for a lost love are an echo from a time when losing your partner meant facing the wilderness alone. So, when we cry from heartbreak today, are we merely feeling a personal sadness, or are we performing an ancient, ingrained ritual of loss that is written into our very DNA? Is our grief not just for the person, but for the shattered promise of a shared future that once meant safety and continuity? Yet, the wilderness we face today is often not one of predators and starvation, but of expectations and fractured identity. Modern love is burdened with a colossal weight of ideals. We are sold a story of a soulmate, of a perfect union that will complete us, a narrative woven from fairy tales and film. The relationship becomes more than a connection. It becomes a foundation upon which we build a vision of ourselves as a partner, a lover, a future spouse or parent. When that relationship dies, the collapse is seismic. The tears that fall are not only for the person who is gone, they are for the version of ourselves that is now rendered obsolete, the shared dreams that turn to dust, the future that vanishes in an instant. We weep for the phantom limb of a life we will never live. The mirror they held up to us in which we were beautiful, wanted, loved shatters, and we are left to piece together an identity from the fragments. In the silence after the door closes, are we crying for the loss of them, or for the disorienting loss of the us we had become? But perhaps to focus solely on the individual experience of crying is to miss a crucial dimension. Across cultures and epochs, tears have rarely been a purely private affair. They are a communal currency, a required part of the script at the most significant junctures of human life. At a funeral, tears are not just an expression of personal grief, they are a public performance of respect, a shared acknowledgement of loss that binds the community together in its mourning. In rites of passage, tears mark the painful, necessary death of an old self to make way for the new. In collective prayer or fervent ritual, They signal a surrender to something greater, a vulnerability that is demanded by the ceremony itself. The tearful individual is, in these moments, playing a role assigned to them by tradition and collective need. Their tears are a language everyone understands, a ritual that affirms a shared reality. This begs an unsettling question of our own solitary sorrows. When we cry alone in our room over a lost love, are we truly alone? Or are we, perhaps unconsciously, performing a ritual for an audience of one, adhering to a deep-seated human script that dictates how one times ought times to mourn the passing of something profound? Are our most private tears actually a deeply public act? And if they are a ritual, a performance ingrained in us by biology and culture, then this leads us to a final, lingering thought. We assume tears are something that simply happen times to times us, an involuntary eruption of inner feeling. But what if we have it backwards? What if the act itself, the hot spill of salt water, the catch in the throat, the ragged breath, is not the end point of emotion, but the very thing that shapes it? We cry, and in the crying, we understand the depth of our own loss. We cry, and in the crying, we communicate a need that words fail to capture. The tear is not just a symptom, it is a statement. It is the body's way of making real what the mind can scarcely comprehend. So, the question is not merely why love makes us cry, but what our tears are trying to build, or rebuild, in the hollowed-out spaces love leaves behind. We learn to speak, to walk, to love. But do we ever truly learn how to cry? Or are we simply following a rhythm written long before we were born, a primal dance of loss and connection where the tear is the first and last step? Perhaps the answer lies not in the reason for the tears, but in their shared, ritualistic nature. From the funeral pyre to the prayer mat, the tear is a universal participant, a required guest at life's most significant thresholds. It is less a personal emotion and more of a communal offering. A tear falls. It traces a path down a cheek at a funeral, a path of glistening salt water amidst a landscape of grief. Another follows. At a wedding, as a father embraces his daughter, the music swelling, and yet another, in the hushed, sterile air of a delivery room, where pain and a profound, staggering joy become one and the same. We see them and we think we understand. This is sadness, that is happiness, the other is relief. But the language of tears is far more complex, far more ancient, and far more cunning than a simple dictionary of emotions. It is a language spoken not just by the heart, but by the whole tribe, a ritual performed for millennia, where a single drop of water can hold the weight of a culture, a duty, and a beautifully orchestrated deception. To view a tear as merely the body's emotional runoff is to miss its deeper ceremony. Crying is not just a behavior we exhibit, it is, in so many ways, a behavior we perform. Across the sweep of human civilization, the act of shedding tears has been woven into the very fabric of ritual. It is taught, practiced, rehearsed, and even hired. It is a social script written in saline, a part we play for an audience of our community and, perhaps most importantly, for ourselves. In these spaces, a tear is less an involuntary leak and more a deliberate punctuation mark. In the story we are collectively telling, a story of loss, of union, of transition. It is a signal that flashes in the silent language between people saying, "This matters. We are here, together, in this moment that is too big for words." Asterisk. Beneath the cultural performance lies a biological stage, set with intricate wiring and chemical cues. When we engage in these rituals, when we sing the mournful dirge, when we hug a grieving friend, when we allow ourselves to wail with the chorus of others, our nervous system stirs. It does not always distinguish cleanly between the performance of an emotion and its genuine experience. The act of Malin, contorting one's face into the mask of sorrow, of forcing the breath into ragged sobs, sends a message backward into the brain. It is a feedback loop written in flesh and electricity. The body convinces the mind. Neurotransmitters are released, the heart rate shifts, and a tear, real and warm, is produced. This is the alchemy of ritual. We enact the feeling to eventually invite it in. And when this happens in a group, the effect multiplies. Tears are contagious. not as a weakness, but as a profound social technology. They broadcast vulnerability and, in doing so, trigger a powerful, empathetic response in others. They dissolve the hard boundaries between individuals, creating a temporary, shared nervous system, a collective heart that beats and breaks in unison, forging a bond stronger than any vow. This is not a new technology. The archaeological record whispers of its ancient practice. In the dust of Egyptian tombs, among the funeral texts meant to guide the dead, there are hints of professional mourners, women whose role was to lead the lament. In ancient China, the ku times or wailing ceremony was a structured performance, a cacophony of grief meant to honor the departed and ensure their safe passage. In Mesoamerica, among the Maya and the Aztecs, hired weepers would accompany funeral processions, their cries a public testament to the importance of the one who had passed. Their tears were a social role, a job description. It was a service rendered to the family, a permission slip for them to unlock their own pent-up sorrow. The message from our ancestors is clear. Tears were not always a private affair. They were a currency of respect, a public performance of loss that helped to channel and make sense of a chaos of feeling. The community's grief needed a voice, and these women became its instrument. Their tears, whether fully felt or expertly performed, were a crucial part of the social machinery, the grease that allowed the wheel of collective emotion to turn. This ritualistic function of tears has not vanished, it has simply changed its costume. Look at a modern wedding, where the father crying as he walks his daughter down the aisle is photographed more than any bouquet. Observe a graduation ceremony, where proud parents weep without shame. See the solemn tears shed sending soldiers off to war, or the tears of a coming-of-age ritual in cultures that still honor them. In these moments, tears are not stifled or hidden away as a sign of weakness. On the contrary, they are expected, encouraged, and often celebrated. They are the visible proof that the ritual is working, that the emotional gravity of the event has been properly acknowledged. This reveals a startling truth about our relationship with our own emotions. We do not only cry because we are overcome. We also cry because, on some deep, unspoken level, we feel we times should. It is an emotional responsibility, a duty to feel the weight of the moment and to show it, to prove our participation in the human contract. The tear becomes a badge of membership, a sign that we understand the stakes, which leads us to a quiet, unsettling question that hangs in the air long after the ceremony ends. If we can be taught to cry, if tears can be learned as part of a social script, then what does that say about their authenticity? Is there not, then, the potential for a perfect mimicry? Could there be individuals among us who have mastered the art of the false tear, the politician welling up on cue during a speech, the actor summoning a glistening eye for a close-up, the reality television star turning on the waterworks for a sympathetic edit? We are quick to dismiss these as cynical manipulations, and often they are. But the ancient, biological machinery doesn't care about our modern cynicism. The act of producing the tear, even a fake one, still involves the same facial contractions, the same controlled breath. It may still send those same faint signals back to the brain, triggering a shadow of the real feeling. And for the audience, the effect can be equally powerful. A televised tear, however staged, can still tug at our heartstrings, can still inspire a wave of empathy or trust. So, we are left to wonder, if a performed tear can evoke a real feeling in the performer and a real response in the audience, then where does the performance end and reality begin? Is the line between a ritual tear and a fraudulent one as clear as we would like to believe, or does it blur into something far more ambiguous, a territory where the very nature of emotional truth is called into question? And if a false tear can wield such power, what does that make of our own? The actor on stage weeps. You watch the muscles of their face contract in practiced anguish. You see the tear ducts release their saline offering, tracing a path through stage makeup. You know, with the logical part of your mind, that this is a performance. It is a scripted sorrow, a pantomime of pain, and yet a familiar pressure builds behind your own eyes. A warmth gathers. Your throat tightens. Why? Why does this calculated display, this artifice of agony, breach your defenses, and find its mark so unerringly in the quiet, vulnerable core of your own being. This paradox lies at the heart of our emotional existence. A tear, whether born from genuine heartbreak or conjured from the craft of an actor, possesses a strange and potent power. It is a key that fits a lock deep within our own biology. This is the first, most profound clue. Emotion is not merely an internal truth, a private weather system of the soul. It is also a biological effect, a contagion that spreads from one body to another through the most primal of signals. We do not just feel our own feelings, we catch them, like a virus, transmitted through a glance, a tone of voice, a shimmer of unshed tears in another's eyes. The performance works because our brains are, in a very real sense, collaborators in the illusion. To understand this, we must descend beneath the level of conscious thought into the ancient architecture of the brain itself. When your eyes perceive the glistening track of a tear, any tear, they send a signal that bypasses the slow, deliberative courts of your prefrontal cortex. It races instead to older, more instinctual regions. The anterior cingulate cortex, a structure deeply involved in processing pain and empathy, flares to life. The insula, which maps our internal bodily states and helps us feel what others might be feeling, begins its silent, empathetic hum. This neural symphony plays the same score whether the stimulus is a documentary about true loss or a melodrama on a moth Thursday night. The brain, in its ancient wisdom, does not pause to authenticate the source of the sorrow before preparing the body to respond. It treats the symbol as if it were the thing itself. This reflex is a relic from a time long before fiction, before deception, before art. It is a survival mechanism, a hardwired imperative to recognize and resonate with the distress of a fellow human. Our logic is a modern addition, a thin veneer over this deep, churning ocean of shared feeling. Can we ever truly rationalize our way out of a response that is, quite literally, baked into our very cells? This dance between the real and the performed is not a modern invention of cinema and theater. If we dig into the archaeological layers of human expression, we find its roots are impossibly old. Imagine the flickering firelight of a prehistoric gathering. A storyteller dons a mask, his body contorting to embody the spirit of a fallen hunter or a vengeful god. His cries are not his own, yet they evoke genuine shivers of awe and terror in his audience. Consider the structured, ritualized wailing of professional mourners in ancient funerals. Their grief is a performance, a job, yet it provides a vessel, a permission slip, for the raw and formless anguish of the true bereaved to flow. In these primordial arts, the community gathered not to be lied to, but to participate in a shared emotional truth. The mask, the chant, the ritualized tear were not fakes. They were tools, technologies of feeling. They were a way of externalizing an internal state, of making the private public, and in doing so, amplifying it, sanctifying it, making it bearable by sharing its weight. Did we invent performance to deceive, or did we invent it to finally, truly connect? Our modern world has simply industrialized this ancient impulse. We live in an ecosystem of manufactured sentiment. Television news broadcasts expertly frame human suffering to maximize our outrage or pity. Advertisements sell us everything from soap to software with a miniature story of struggle and redemption capped with a tear of joy. Politicians, polished to a high gloss, speak of hope and fear with voices cracking on cue. We are all sophisticated consumers of narrative. We understand the mechanics of manipulation. We can deconstruct the editing, the soundtrack, the lighting designed to pull our heartstrings. And yet, we are pulled. We consent to the manipulation because we crave the emotional journey. We want to feel the catharsis, the shared outrage, the swelling of collective pride. The emotion that blooms in us is real. Its physiological effects are measurable. Our racing heart, our damp palms, even if its origin is a soundstage. This presents a dizzying hall of mirrors, a real feeling generated by a fake stimulus, experienced by a real person. If the outcome is authentic, does the authenticity of the source even matter? Or have we evolved to value the effect of emotion over its origin? But this leads us to a quieter, more personal question, one that unsettles our sense of self. If a tear can be learned, if it can be rehearsed in a mirror and deployed with precision for an audition, for a sympathetic boss, for a lover who needs to see your remorse, then what does that say about our own most private moments? The line between the performance and the performer begins to blur. We all, to some extent, play roles: the competent professional, the comforting friend, the devoted child. We learn the scripts society provides for grief, for joy, for love. We learn what a convincing tear looks like. So when we cry alone in the dark, is that the pure, unvarnished truth of us? Or is it simply a performance for an audience of one, a solitary rehearsal of a feeling we have been taught, from birth, how to have? Are we feeling, or are we merely remembering what feeling looks like? This brings us gently, inevitably, to the next layer of the inquiry, to the very source of the tear itself. A newborn's cry is a raw, biological siren, a signal of distress untethered from any conscious understanding of sadness or performance. It is pure need. But as we grow, we learn. We learn that certain cries bring comfort, others bring attention. We see adults cry at funerals and at weddings, and we slowly, unconsciously, map the appropriate emotional terrain. We are taught, directly and indirectly, when it is acceptable to cry and when it is expected. We learn to wield our tears, just as we learn to stifle them. So, the final, lingering thought that hangs in the air after the curtain falls is not an answer, but a deeper, more fundamental puzzle about the nature of our own humanity. If the tear is both instinct and invention, both a primal reflex and a socialized symbol, then where does the performance end and the person begin? A newborn's first cry is a reflex, a sharp, guttural announcement of life. It is a sound ripped from the lungs, a biological imperative for air, a signal of pure existence. But that sound, though it may be called a cry, is dry. The first emotional tears, those salty, hot tears of true feeling, do not arrive with birth. They come later, weeks, or even months after, in a moment of quiet revelation. They arrive not from an internal ache of hunger or cold, but from an external, dawning awareness. They arrive when the infant learns to see the other. This is the first, fragile bridge between a solitary being and a social world. The reflexive cry is instinct, a hardwired survival tool as fundamental as a heartbeat. But the cry of hurt, of frustration, of longing, of a tiny heart feeling its first fissure of abandonment, this is something else entirely. This is a behavior learned, honed, and perfected through observation and the intricate dance of feedback from the social environment, most specifically from the caregiver. It is our first, most primal performance for an audience, and our most effective manipulation of it. On a biological level, the evidence is clear. In the early months, an infant's tears are purely utilitarian, serving to lubricate the eye or flush out an irritant. The complex neurological machinery required to produce emotional tears born from a feeling interpreted by the brain, simply isn't online yet. The system is still booting up, but around the 6-month mark, a profound shift occurs. The social nervous system begins to blossom, a network of perception and connection. The infant starts to not just feel, but to times interpret a situation. A toy is taken away, a familiar face leaves the room, a tone of voice shifts from cooing to cross. The infant's brain, this magnificent pattern recognition machine, begins its work. It connects the internal feeling of distress with the external event, and crucially, it connects its own reflexive cry to the powerful response it elicits: the hurried footsteps, the warm embrace, the soothing voice. The cry evolves. It is no longer just a signal, it is a tool. The first emotional tear is a milestone not of physiology, but of psychology, the first drop of social understanding. If we were to dig through the layers of human history, to sift through the archaeological remains of ancient cradles, we would find not bones, but behaviors fossilized in ritual and art. In every culture, in every epoch, the act of picking up a crying child, of rocking, shushing, and comforting, has been a constant. This was never merely a reflex of nurture, a simple urge to quiet a noise. It was, and is, the very foundation of emotional and social development. It is the primary dialogue of care. The ancient mother humming a lament to her fretful child was doing more than soothing. She was teaching. With every gentle rock, every murmured word, the lesson was reinforced. You are not alone. Your signal has been received. I am here. The child, in its profound, pre-verbal wisdom, learns the equation. It is the most fundamental transaction of trust. Cry equals response. This consistent, reliable feedback loop writes the first rules of human connection onto the blank slate of a soul. It teaches that vulnerability, expressed, can summon strength. That need, voiced, can be met. But what does it teach when the equation fails? The modern social layer adds a dizzying complexity to this ancient learning. A child today is born into a world of performed emotion, a circus of mirrored feelings. They see tears everywhere. They watch a cartoon character well up with exaggerated comedic sadness after a setback. They see a hero on a screen cry a single perfect tear of righteous grief. They witness, with terrifying clarity, the real-world drama of parents arguing, the raw, unscripted tears of adult frustration and pain. They are astute students of this theater, and they learn. They learn the nuances. They learn that tears can be a weapon to delay bedtime, a tool to secure a desired toy, a language to apologize when words are insufficient, a glue to hold a fracturing attention, a chain to keep a weary adult from leaving the room. The cry becomes sophisticated, a social language as learned and nuanced as spoken word itself. It acquires dialects of manipulation, accents of genuine plea, and the formal grammar of performative sorrow. We learn to speak with our tears long before we master the subtleties of apology or flattery. But if this is the language we are taught, who decides when the conversation is over? This learning, this intricate social dance of tearful communication, leads us to a deeper, more unsettling water. If we are taught the grammar of crying, if we learn the precise situations that warrant this potent emotional release, then what environment, what lesson, finally teaches a human being to stop? Perhaps the answer lies not in the learning, but in the unlearning. It lies in the quiet, private moments where the equation of childhood breaks down, where a cry, no matter how loud or how practiced, meets only silence, where the performance has no audience. It is in that void that the social function of tears withers, and something else, something more primal and perhaps more true, might take its place. For if tears are a language learned from others, then their cessation must be a silence we teach ourselves. But what happens when the words of that language fail, when the performance collapses under the weight of a feeling too vast for even tears to express? What is the sound of the soul when it confronts a wall that crying cannot scale? There comes a moment, subtle and unannounced, when the lump in your throat becomes a familiar guest. The world blurs at the edges, a heat builds behind your eyes, and a primal urge demands release, a sob, a wail, a cascade of tears. But instead, you swallow. You take a slow, deliberate breath. You blink, and the world snaps back into a hard, clear focus. The moment passes, quelled by an invisible force. When did you learn to do that? No one ever sat you down and handed you a formal decree. There was no official manual titled The Appropriate Suppression of Feeling. The lesson was far more diffuse, communicated in a language of glances and silences. It was in the flustered, slightly panicked shushing of a parent when a scraped knee produced not just blood but a deafening cry in a quiet supermarket aisle. It was in the well-meaning, yet deeply telling, phrase whispered with an awkward pat. Big kids don't cry. It was in the averted gaze of a stranger, a look that conveyed not empathy, but a mild, uncomfortable judgment. We learned the grammar of emotional restraint not through direct instruction, but through a slow, cultural osmosis. We learned that certain feelings, in certain spaces, are simply not the done thing. The raw, unfiltered expression of sorrow or rage became a social faux pas, a breach of an unspoken contract we all seem to have signed without reading. This act of suppression, this internal civil war, is not merely a social construct. It has a precise address within the architecture of ourselves, deep within the folded cortex of the brain. Behind our foreheads lies the prefrontal cortex, a region that matures slowly, patiently, over decades. This is the seat of executive function, the conductor of our mental orchestra, the arbiter of impulse and long-term planning. In childhood, the amygdala, the ancient alarm bell of fear and raw emotion, often holds the baton. A child's laughter is instantaneous and all-consuming. Their tears are a total eclipse of the self. But as we age, the prefrontal cortex strengthens its connections. It begins to whisper, then to speak, then sometimes to shout down the amygdala's sirens. It applies reason to rage, context to grief, and social calculus to joy. This neural negotiation is the biological bedrock of our swallowed tears. That tightness in your chest, that forced calm, that is your prefrontal cortex in its full, matured glory, placing a firm, steadying hand on the shoulder of your inner child, asserting control for the sake of the tribe, for the sake of order, for the sake of getting through the day. Is this maturation, then, the ultimate triumph of reason over chaos, or is it the beginning of a quiet, internal fracture? We can trace the fossil record of this fracture back through the ashes of ancient fires. The very structure of human civilization may be built upon this capacity to delay, to disguise, to suppress immediate gratification and raw emotion. When early humans began to form complex social hierarchies, roles, and responsibilities, the ability to keep face transformed from a social nicety into a survival skill. In a small, interdependent band, an unchecked tantrum could alienate a crucial ally. A public display of uncontrollable grief could be seen as a weakness, inviting predation. The rituals that marked the passage from childhood to adulthood across countless cultures often centered on this very theme, the mastery of one's own nature. A young warrior was taught to withstand pain without flinching. A leader was expected to project unwavering confidence even in the face of terror. To be an adult was to wear a mask, and the mask's primary function was to hold the floodwaters of feeling at bay. The community's survival depended on it. Did our first cities rise not just on foundations of mud brick, but on a foundation of collectively held breath? This ancient inheritance now plays out on the modern stage, its scripts rehearsed in living rooms and schoolyards. The lessons are now more explicit, yet no less powerful. Boys are taught, with 1,000 subtle and not-so-subtle cues, that boys don't cry, that vulnerability is synonymous with weakness. Their emotional vocabulary is pruned back until only anger and stoicism remain acceptable. Girls, meanwhile, may be permitted tears, but often within a narrow band of acceptability, not too loud, not too long, and never over something silly. For adults, the performance becomes even more refined. We learn to compartmentalize, to save it for later, to cry only in the approved privacy of a parked car or a pillow-smothered night. Emotion, the very thing that makes us feel most alive, is systematically pushed to the margins, treated as an inconvenient, messy byproduct to be managed and hidden. The unspoken goal is a state of seamless, frictionless functionality. We have traded the raw truth of a tear for the polished lie of a calm surface. What is the cumulative weight of all these unshed tears, and where does that weight eventually settle? It is a fundamental law of physics, and perhaps of feeling, that energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be transferred, transformed, or contained. An emotion felt is a wave that crests and breaks upon the shore of the self. An emotion suppressed is a wave forced back upon itself, its energy churning inward, seeking alternate paths of release. The tear that is not shed does not simply vanish, it migrates. It might harden into a knot of tension between the shoulder blades, a permanent ache of held-back sorrow. It might curdle into a diffuse, free-floating anxiety that colors everything a shade of gray. It might fuel a sudden, inexplicable outburst of irritation over a misplaced set of keys, a disproportionate anger that is really the ghost of a grief that was never allowed to speak its name. If we are no longer permitted the primal language of tears, what new, more convoluted dialects does our pain invent to make itself heard? And yet, in a strange and beautiful paradox, the very same mind that mastered suppression also crafted a secret backdoor for its escape. We may build walls around our own hearts, but we leave the windows open for the sorrows of others. We who have learned to swallow our own tears can still be moved to cry by a melody that speaks of a loss we've never known, by the tragic arc of a fictional character in a book, by the haunting beauty of a photograph from a time and place we never inhabited. This abstract, empathetic grief is a miracle of cognition. It requires a brain sophisticated enough to project itself into another's reality, to feel a shadow of their pain as its own. It is sorrow at one remove, purified and safe. The tear shed for art is a permitted tear, a sanctioned catharsis. It is the feeling, without the real-world consequences. Does this mean our capacity for imagined sorrow is the necessary pressure valve for all the real sorrow we dare not express? And if we can cry for a story, what does that story understand about us that we have forgotten ourselves? There are pains so deep, so complex, that they defy the simple, cathartic release of tears. You feel the weight of them, a dense, heavy stone lodged somewhere behind your sternum, but your eyes remain stubbornly dry. The world expects a flood, a visible signal of your internal storm, but you offer only a barren silence, and yet the body keeps score. In the absence of tears, the debt of sorrow must be paid in other currencies. A restless night that refuses to grant you sanctuary, a dull, throbbing headache that pulses behind your eyes, a profound melancholy that colors the world in shades of gray. It begs a quiet, unsettling question. If the tears are not falling, where do they go? Have they simply evaporated, or have they been transmuted, alchemized within the crucible of the body into something else entirely, something more insidious and far less understood? When we are compelled to suppress our emotions, whether by social decree, personal stoicism, or the sheer, overwhelming nature of the grief itself, the brain does not simply obey a command to shut them down. It is not a switch that can be flipped off. Instead, it behaves more like a pressured system, rerouting the emotional torrent through alternative channels. The feeling, denied its primary exit, seeks other forms of expression. It migrates, seeping into the physical vessel that contains it, manifesting in the twitch of a muscle, the clench of a jaw, the erratic beat of a heart. It rewires behavior, pushing us toward actions we cannot logically explain, a sudden outburst of anger over a triviality, a retreat into profound isolation. It haunts the liminal spaces of our consciousness, corrupting our sleep with fractured, anxious dreams and stealing the rest we so desperately need. The body, in its infinite and ancient wisdom, insists on communicating the distress that the mind has been forced to silence. It speaks a language of symptoms, a Morse code of suffering tapped out on the skin, in the gut, in the weary soul. Biologically, this suppression is a declaration of war on the self. The act of crying is not a sign of weakness. It is a sophisticated pressure valve, a physiological release mechanism evolutionarily honed over millennia. When we cry, especially emotional tears rich with stress hormones and proteins, we are quite literally purging our system of a toxic buildup. To stifle this process is to force the body to reabsorb its own poisons. The stress response, initially designed for short-term survival, becomes a perpetual state of emergency. Cortisol, the primary stress hormone, floods the bloodstream and remains there, its levels refusing to recede. This chemical bath keeps the body on high alert, a constant state of fight or flight with no enemy in sight and no escape possible. Muscles tense into a permanent state of readiness, leading to chronic pain in the back, neck, and shoulders. The digestive system, deemed non-essential in a crisis, rebels in the form of cramps, bloating, and irritable bowels. The cardiovascular system labors under the strain, pushing blood pressure into dangerous territory. Inside the cranium, the neurological drama intensifies. The amygdala, the brain's ancient alarm bell, grows hyperactive, screaming warnings at the slightest provocation. Without the calming feedback loop that emotional release provides, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of reason and regulation, struggles to quiet the noise. This neural stalemate is the very engine of chronic anxiety, a self-sustaining loop of fear and apprehension where the threat is internal, a ghost the body cannot outrun. The tears that never fell were meant to be a message of release, a signal to the entire organism that the storm has passed and it is safe to stand down. In their absence, the alarm rings on, until its sound becomes the only thing we know. If we dig deeper into the archaeological layers of human experience, we find that tears were never meant to be a solitary affair. In countless ancient and traditional communities, grief was a communal performance, a shared ritual. There were professional mourners whose job was to lead the lament, their wails giving permission and form to the private anguish of others. There were songs of loss that entire villages would sing together, their voices weaving a tapestry of shared sorrow that held the weight for any single individual. There were ceremonies where crying was not just allowed but required, a collective venting of psychic steam. This was not mere drama, it was a crucial technology of social and psychological hygiene. It was a way for a community to metabolize pain together, to transform individual trauma into a shared narrative, thereby diluting its destructive power. The modern world, for all its comforts, has largely dismantled these rituals. We grieve in isolated apartments. We cry silently in soundproofed cars on the commute home. We offer muted condolences at funerals that are often brief, sanitized affairs. We are expected to process cataclysmic loss and then return to productivity, our sadness neatly contained and out of sight. But the need for expression has not vanished. It has simply been displaced. Without the sanctioned space for collective crying, the body of the community and the individuals within it must find substitute expressions. Could it be that the epidemic of insomnia that grips our cities is a form of unsung lament? Might the rampant addictions to substances and screens be a desperate, misguided search for the numbness that follows a good, long cry? Is the proliferation of chronic pain syndromes and mysterious illnesses the body's way of acting out the grief that has no other stage? The tears have gone underground, and they water a different, far thornier harvest. In this modern social landscape, the individual who cannot cry often pays the highest price. Psychology has a term for this internal redirecting of sorrow, grief turned inward. It is a process where anguish, with no external outlet, reverses its course and begins to consume the host. This inverted grief becomes the fuel for a spectrum of psychological ailments. It manifests not as quiet sadness but as a sharp, unpredictable irritability, a hair-trigger temper that lashes out at loved ones. It can erupt in impulsive, self-destructive behaviors, reckless decisions, binge eating, self-harm, anything to feel a different, more manageable kind of pain, to create a visible wound that matches the invisible one. Or, it can implode into the heavy, suffocating stillness of depression, a state where the weight of the unshed tears becomes so immense that it paralyzes the will to feel anything at all. The emotion, trapped within, becomes a toxin, and the body and mind begin to slowly poison themselves. Yet, for all the silent violence of suppressed tears, there exists a state even more terrifying. It is not the struggle to hold back the flood, but the chilling realization that the desire to cry has vanished entirely. It is the emotional flatline, the profound numbness where not only the tears but the very feeling that generates them has gone dormant. What is this state, if not the body's final, desperate defense against a pain it has decided is unsurvivable? A full systemic shutdown of the heart? If tears are the language of a soul in distress, then what does its permanent silence signify? And in the quiet that follows, are we looking at a form of peace or the deepest wound of all? There are those who cannot cry. It is not a matter of strength, not a stoic choice made from a place of power. It is something else entirely, a hollowed-out silence where a storm should be. The tears simply do not come, not because the well of feeling is too shallow, but because it has been drained to its dusty bed. This is not control. It is a profound and unsettling shutdown. In the deepest reaches of hurt, in the shadowlands of prolonged trauma, the human emotional apparatus can simply cease to function. The capacity to weep, that most fundamental of human expressions, vanishes. What remains is not peace, but a flat, arid landscape where sorrow has forgotten its own language. Imagine a heart that has been asked to bear too much for too long. The weight is not a sharp, clean break, but a constant, grinding pressure that eventually forces a system-wide failure. The nerves are overloaded, the emotional circuits fried. To feel anything at all, even the pain becomes unbearable, and so the mind, in a desperate act of self-preservation, throws the master switch. It severs the connection between the event and the sensation, between the internal wound and its external expression. The person becomes a spectator to their own life, watching tragedies unfold behind a thick, soundproof pane of glass. They can describe the loss, articulate the grief in clinical terms, but they cannot times perform times it. The tears, those salty messengers of the soul, are refused their passport. Is this the body's final mercy, or its ultimate betrayal? Beneath the surface of this emotional drought lies a stark biological reality. Clinicians have a name for this state: emotional blunting. It is not a poetic metaphor but a neurological condition, often linked to a severe depletion of crucial neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. These are the chemical couriers of mood, motivation, and feeling. When their levels plummet, the world loses its color and its texture. Joy has no flavor. Sadness has no weight. The nervous system, overwhelmed by a constant barrage of stress hormones like cortisol, makes an executive decision. It decides that to feel is to risk annihilation, and so it initiates a lockdown. It walls off the emotional centers of the brain, creating a kind of psychic quarantine. This survival mechanism spares the organism from immediate collapse, but it does so at a terrible cost. It also blocks the primary pressure valve, the release found in a good hard cry. The very mechanism designed to save you also prevents you from healing. So we must ask, what does it mean when the body's defense against pain becomes a barrier to our own recovery? If we could dig through the layers of human history, what would we find? There is no fossil record for dried tears, no archaeological site that can preserve a moment of silent grief. Yet, the evidence is there, etched not in stone, but in the collective memory of cultures that have endured the unendurable. In the aftermath of wars, famines, and genocides, historians and anthropologists often note a curious and chilling phenomenon. Survivors speak of communities where the crying simply stopped. After the initial waves of anguish, a strange stillness would descend. They describe faces that were empty, voices that were flat, people who went through the motions of mourning without its accompanying emotional release. They had seen too much, lost too much, and the collective trauma was so vast that it exceeded the individual's capacity to process it. The tears, it seemed, had been used up. This was not a personal failure but a societal wound, a shared emotional paralysis that served as a stark marker of a people pushed beyond their breaking point. Could an entire culture become emotionally blunt, its shared heart turning to stone as a way to simply make it through another day? This historical echo finds its clear and painful resonance in the modern therapy room. For a therapist, one of the most concerning signs in a patient with deep depression is not incessant crying, but its utter absence. They sit and recount a litany of losses: a failed marriage, a lost job, a death in the family, with a detached, almost analytical calm. They speak of their own pain as if it were a theoretical concept, a problem to be solved rather than a wound to be felt. They have not become strong, they have become disconnected. This emotional paralysis is a formidable obstacle to healing. Therapy often works by guiding a person back into contact with their feelings, by helping them to feel safe enough to finally let the dam break. But when the mechanism for that release is itself broken, the path forward becomes murky and difficult. How does one reconnect a person to a feeling they can no longer access? The inability to cry becomes more than a symptom. It is a locked door, and on the other side of it is the very pain that needs to be confronted. Is the goal of healing, then, to first teach a person how to weep again, so we are left with a tentative, almost paradoxical observation? Perhaps the ability to cry is not a sign of weakness, but a privilege. It is a privilege afforded to those whose nervous systems are still engaged, who have not yet been pushed into that silent, emotional exile. It is the privilege of a biology that still believes in its own capacity to reset and recover. To weep is to be fully, vulnerably, messily human. And therefore, the journey back from that flat line of feeling, the first shuddering breath that leads to a single tear tracking down a numb cheek, is not just about managing symptoms. It is a reclamation. It is the slow, tentative return of a soul to its body. It is the nervous system tentatively believing once more that it is safe to feel. And if that is true, then what does it mean that the body itself might hold the key to its own reset? That the very act of crying is not just an expression of pain, but its intended release? What if a tear is not the end of a feeling, but its beginning? I feel lighter after crying. It's a simple, almost cliché statement, whispered in the quiet after a storm of emotion. We've all felt it, that palpable shift in the weight of the world upon our shoulders. But this lightness is not just a poetic turn of phrase, it is a biological reality, a deeply programmed response written into our very cells over millions of years. Tears are not merely a reaction, they are an action. They are an act of self-repair, a silent, saline language of healing spoken by the body when words fail. Biologically, the act of crying is a masterful orchestration of chemistry and physiology. When emotional distress triggers the amygdala, it sets off a cascade of stress hormones, primarily cortisol, flooding our system with the ancient signal to fight or flee. But then, something else happens. The lacrimal glands are activated, not just to lubricate the eye, but to release a complex cocktail of tears rich in stress hormones and proteins. As they trace paths down our cheeks, they are not just leaving the body, they are carrying the crisis out with them. Studies show that crying stimulates the production of oxytocin and endorphins, the body's natural opiates for pain and bonding. The heart rate, once frantic, begins to slow. The sharp, shallow breaths of anxiety deepen into sighs. The nervous system, having been pitched into a state of high alert, is gently guided back toward a state of rest and recovery. It is a physiological reset, a literal washing away of the internal storm. The body, in its profound wisdom, uses saltwater to balance its own internal sea. This biological ritual finds a powerful echo in our deep past. For our ancestors, grief and loss were not private affairs, but communal events. Archaeologists and anthropologists point to evidence of collective grieving rituals across ancient cultures, from the communal wailing of funeral dirges to the ecstatic, sorrowful dances of separation. These were not merely ceremonies of farewell. They were technologies of emotional detoxification. In a shared space of tears, individual pain was diluted and transformed into collective resilience. The community gathered not just to witness the end of a life, but to participate in the beginning of its memory, to affirm that the loss of one was a wound to all, and that the healing of all would aid the one. The tears shed together were a social glue, binding people in their shared vulnerability. In this light, the tear is not a symbol of termination, but a catalyst for transition. It marks the moment the internal pain becomes external, and in doing so, allows the community to help carry its weight. Yet, in our modern, hyper-efficient society, we often treat tears as an inconvenience, a sign of weakness to be suppressed in boardrooms and public spaces. We offer tissues to stop the flow, not to facilitate it. We apologize for our tears, as if for a social transgression. This stands in stark contrast to what occurs in the sanctum of psychological therapy. There, a therapist often sees the first tear not as a breakdown, but as a breakthrough. It is the moment the intellectual fortress around a trauma cracks, revealing the raw, feeling human within. The patient who finally cries has stopped talking times about times the pain and has started to times experience times it, to process it on the elemental level where it truly resides. One might wonder how many individuals remain stuck in cycles of anger, numbness, or depression not because their pain is too great, but because they have never been granted the permission, the safety, or the courage to fully cry. Their unshed tears become a stagnant, internal lake, poisoning them from within. So, we see the tear as a biological balm, a social bond, and a psychological pivot, but its function may run even deeper. Perhaps tears are not just agents of healing, but also vessels of memory. Each drop that falls is a tiny archive, carrying with it the biochemical signature of a specific sorrow, a particular joy. Could it be that the very act of crying is what helps to etch certain emotional experiences into the long-term memory of our species? That we remember not just the event, but the feeling of its release? The tear, in its fleeting existence, might be the key to preserving the emotional truth of what it means to be human, ensuring that we never truly forget what we have felt. But what happens when this ancient healing river runs dry? What is the cost of a life without tears? There are memories that have faded at the edges, their details softened by time into a watercolor blur of half-remembered facts. The exact words spoken are lost, the specific shade of the sky is forgotten. Yet, Every time that particular ghost of the past drifts into your mind, a familiar, physical sensation follows. It is a tightening in the throat, a slight, involuntary tremor of the chin, a sudden, surprising sting at the corners of your eyes. The event itself is a photograph left too long in the sun, but the feeling remains in high definition, vivid and immediate. It is as if the memory was not just recorded, but times felt times into existence, and the tear is its most persistent signature. This is not a flaw in our mental machinery, but a feature of its profound design. The human brain does not simply file away events in cold, neutral archives. It captures the entire sensory and emotional weather of a moment, bundling the objective facts with the subjective storm. And in this intricate process, tears are not a sign of system failure. They are the biological ink, a unique saline script used to etch certain experiences more deeply into the fabric of who we are. They are the tangible proof that we felt something enough to remember it with our bodies, not just our minds. This begins in the ancient, deep brain architecture, where emotion and memory are forged together in a neural partnership. The amygdala, our alarm system and emotional core, and the hippocampus, the meticulous scribe of autobiographical memory, are in constant, intimate conversation. When an event carries a significant emotional charge, whether of joy, grief, fear, or awe, the amygdala sounds the alarm. It tags the moment as important, dialing up the volume on the experience. This signal prompts the hippocampus to pay closer attention, to work with greater urgency, to encode the details of what is happening. The stronger the emotion, the more potent the chemical bath that bathes these neural circuits, cementing the synaptic connections. In this light, a tear is not the byproduct of the process. It is the outward physical echo of that internal chemical cascade. We do not cry because we are merely remembering. We remember, so vividly, in part times because times we cried. The act does not erase, it engraves. We can trace this indelible link between feeling and remembering back through the echoes of our shared history long before the written word. Our ancestors did not record their lives in sterile lists of facts. Their first chronicles were painted in the profound darkness of caves, depicting the awe and terror of the hunt, the sacred power of the animals they relied upon and feared. These were not mere illustrations. They were emotional transcripts, created in a state of high ceremony and potent feeling. They gathered around fires not to recite dry histories, but to share stories, tales of heroism and loss, of love and vengeance, their faces illuminated by the flames, their voices thick with emotion. The earliest burial rites, where we first see evidence of humans caring for their dead, were saturated with grief, with love, with a fearful hope for what might lie beyond. In these moments, tears were the communal mortar, the shared material that helped build a collective, emotional history. They transformed individual experience into a story that could be felt and recalled by the entire tribe, ensuring that what mattered most, what was felt most deeply, would not be forgotten with the passing of a single generation. The tears shed were the price paid to make a memory permanent. This ancient mechanism is not lost on us in the modern world. It is merely amplified by our interconnectedness. Our most potent collective memories are not of neutral news reports, but of events that united us in a single, overwhelming emotional response. The shared grief following a national tragedy, the collective anguish of a natural disaster, the euphoric tears of a long hoped-for reunion. These are the moments that define eras and identities. We say we cried together, and in doing so, we encoded that experience not just into our individual minds, but into the psyche of the community. Psychologists call this emotional tagging, where the intense feeling associated with an event binds it to our sense of self, both personal and social. The memory becomes a pillar of our identity precisely because it is emotionally weighted. We are, in a very real sense, the sum of the things that have moved us to tears. They are the bookmarks in the story of our lives, marking the passages where feeling became inseparable from fact. So it seems that the tear is far more than a simple release valve for pent-up feeling. It is an active participant in the very construction of the self. It is the tool our biology uses to ensure that we remember what it means to be human, to love, to lose, to hope, to despair. These salty drops help to write our story, ensuring the most poignant chapters are never erased. They do not just help us remember, they, in a way, create the us that is doing the remembering. This leads us to a quiet, lingering wonder, a question that hangs in the air long after the feeling has passed. If this is the mechanism that makes us who we are, what does it mean that humans are the only creatures on Earth known to shed tears born purely from emotion? This intricate dance between memory and feeling suggests that our past is not a static recording but a living current, one that can be summoned back with a force that is both mental and startlingly physical. To recall a moment of profound sadness is not just to think it, it is to feel the echo of its ache, to sense the ghost of that old weight settling in the chest. The nervous system, it seems, stores our most significant emotions not merely as words or images in a filing cabinet, but as entire somatic scripts, a set of instructions for the body to reenact a shadow of the original feeling. The tear that falls upon remembrance is then the final, perfect piece of evidence. It is the body completing the circuit, proving that the memory is stored not in the mind alone, but in the very fabric of our being. The thought triggers the feeling, and the feeling triggers the tear, a perfect, closed loop of recall. But if a memory can trigger a physical response years later, where, precisely, does the past end and the present begin? Many creatures possess tear ducts. Many produce cries of pain, but only humans weep from feeling. Consider the scene. A lone elephant, separated from its herd, may vocalize its distress in low, rumbling frequencies that travel through the earth. A young chimpanzee, having lost its mother, will wail and whimper. These are sounds of pure, unmediated need. They are signals, yes, but they are signals of a present and urgent state. They exist in the immediate now. They do not, as far as we can tell, spring from the intricate, labyrinthine contemplation of a feeling. They do not represent the feeling. They are times the feeling, expressed as sound. Human emotional tears are something else entirely. They are not merely a symptom of an internal state. They are a performance of it, a silent, saline language distilled from the deepest wells of our consciousness. Somewhere along the branching path of millions of years of evolution, our species, and seemingly ours alone, transformed a simple biological lubricant into a sophisticated tool of emotional communication. What singular twist of fate, what confluence of mind and body made us so unique? The biological layer offers a starting point, a foundation of simple facts. In most mammals, tear ducts serve a purely practical purpose. They bathe the cornea, keeping it clear of dust and infection. It is a maintenance system, elegant in its simplicity. But in humans, this system was co-opted for another, far more complex duty. The trigger lies not in the eye, but in the brain. Our social brain, a dense, interconnected web of regions like the prefrontal cortex and the anterior cingulate, is a marvel of evolutionary over-engineering. It grants us not just emotion, but meta-emotion, the ability to feel, and simultaneously to be aware that we are feeling. It allows us to model the inner worlds of others, to guess at their joys and sorrows. This neural architecture is the stage upon which the drama of a tear is set. When we cry for grief, it is not merely a response to loss. It is a profound recognition of that loss, a cognitive appraisal so deep it overflows its banks. The tear duct becomes an escape valve for an overwhelmed consciousness. So, we do not just feel sadness, we contemplate it, and the tear is the physical evidence of that contemplation. It is a message, bottled and released, waiting to be understood by another similarly complex mind. But biology leaves few fossils. How can we trace the origin of something as ephemeral as a feeling, as fleeting as a tear? There will be no ancient skull with a tear-stained cheekbone preserved in stone. We must look for its shadow, for the behaviors that would necessitate such a profound internal experience. The archaeological record shows a startling shift with the arrival of time's Homo sapiens. We began to bury our dead, and not merely to dispose of them. We placed tools and flowers and ochre pigments in graves, provisions for a journey we imagined. We created art on cave walls that spoke of myth and spirit. These are not the actions of creatures living solely in the present tense. They are the products of a deep, aching awareness of time, of mortality, of connection and its severance. This symbolic mind, capable of conceiving of an afterlife and mourning its absence, must have needed a physical expression for its most torrential emotions. Could it be that the emotional tear was a key part of this new emotional toolkit? It is a silent signal of vulnerability that, paradoxically, strengthens social bonds. It signals a need for comfort without the aggression of a scream. In the harsh world of our ancestors, a community that could communicate profound empathy and shared sorrow would have been more cohesive, more resilient. The tear, then, may have been a weapon of survival, forged in the silent, internal fires of a brain learning to know itself. This capacity for deep feeling, and for its eloquent expression, became the very bedrock of human civilization. Our modern social world, a sprawling tapestry of art, music, literature, religion, and law, is built upon this foundational ability to share our inner lives. The tragic play moves us to catharsis because we see our own potential for loss reflected on the stage. The symphony swells, and we feel a collective pang of beauty. The tear is the ultimate testament to this depth of interior life, a life so rich and complex that it must sometimes spill out into the visible world. It is the proof that we are more than just stimulus and response. We are stories waiting to be told, and tears are the punctuation in those stories. They are the periods at the end of sentences of grief, the exclamation points of joy, the ellipses of overwhelming awe. No other creature, in its natural state, leaves behind a gallery of paintings, composes an opera, or builds a temple to its gods. And no other creature sheds tears for the beauty of such creations. Our tears are the silent, salty signature of our humanity. And so, the tear emerges as a beautiful paradox. It is a signal of ultimate vulnerability, a public admission that we are broken, lost, or overwhelmed. Yet, it is also one of our species' greatest evolutionary strengths. It disarms aggression and invites compassion. It forges connections where words fail. It made us collaborators and companions, allowing us to build societies rather than merely survive in them. This humble drop of saltwater helped the fragile, hairless ape become a global force. But in our hyper-connected, digitally mediated modern world, a new question whispers at the edges of this thought. We perform our lives for screens, our emotions often reduced to emojis and curated posts. Do we still allow ourselves the raw, unedited, and profoundly physical experience of a genuine tear? Have we, in building a civilization upon the power of emotional connection, begun to lose the authentic language of it? If tears are the language of overwhelming feeling, then what does it mean when they fall not in shadow, but in the brightest of lights? Why does a profoundly happy heart also seek to overflow? You cry, perhaps in the dim glow of a screen, or alone in a room that feels too large. The tears are real, a hot and silent signal of a wound within. But the world does not tilt on its axis. No one comes, no hand rests on your shoulder. The signal, it seems, has been sent but not received. And in that void, a peculiar and terrifying sensation blooms, a feeling of fading, of becoming a ghost in your own life, as if your very substance is thinning into nothingness. We live in an age of emotional spectacle, a grand and endless parade of feeling curated for public consumption. Social media feeds are flooded with performative grief, with outrage manufactured for engagement, with joy polished to a high-gloss sheen. We scroll through a universe of tears, each one vying for a sliver of our attention. The result is a kind of empathy indigestion, a world so saturated with displayed emotion that our capacity to genuinely feel for another has been blunted, stretched thin like old canvas. In this economy of attention, the most authentic tears can be the ones that hold the least value. They are lost in the noise, their raw, unedited truth too stark against a backdrop of artifice. The tear, once a universal signal of distress, a primal call for connection, now risks becoming just another piece of content, judged for its aesthetic appeal or its narrative potential rather than its truth. If we could peer inside the brain at the precise moment a solitary tear falls unacknowledged, we would witness a silent, biological tragedy. The insula, a region deep within the cortex, acts as the body's emotional dashboard, integrating the raw feeling of the body with the social meaning of the moment. It anticipates a response. When we express pain, our neural circuitry is wired to expect a reciprocal signal, a mirroring frown, a comforting tone, a look of concern. This feedback loop is the bedrock of human connection. But when the cry is met with silence, when the signal echoes back, nothing, the insula registers a profound error. It is not merely disappointment, it is a neurological disconnection. The brain's alarm bells ring not for the initial pain, but for the social void. It processes the silence as a form of exile, triggering the same ancient panic that a mammal feels when separated from the herd. The pain is no longer just emotional or physical, it is existential. The message from the world is clear. You are not seen, therefore, in a very real sense, you are not. This neural response is an ancient relic, a whisper from our deep past. For the vast majority of human history, survival was not an individual pursuit but a collective project. To be cast out was a death sentence. In early hunter-gatherer bands, every emotional expression was a vital piece of social technology. A tear was not a private event, it was a public broadcast, a request for aid that was essential for the group's cohesion. To ignore it was a deliberate act of severance. The weight of that ignorance was a biological punishment, a tool to enforce social norms. The unresponded to tear was the first step toward banishment, triggering a cascade of stress hormones and a deep, visceral terror. The community's attention was the cradle that held the individual. Its absence was a form of exposure to the elements, a withdrawal of the most fundamental protection. To be ignored in pain was to be made invisible, and to be invisible was to cease to matter to the tribe upon which your life depended. Our modern world has created a paradox of connection. We are more linked than any generation before us, yet we have engineered new forms of profound isolation. The very tools that promise to bring us together often facilitate this emotional neglect. We witness tears on a screen, but they are pixels of light, easily dismissed with a scroll. We are presented with so much curated suffering that we build calluses on our souls to cope. The viral video of a person crying might garner millions of views, but the currency is curiosity, not compassion. It is tragedy as entertainment. This commodification of feeling creates a cruel irony. The more performative tears flood the market, the less value an authentic, private tear holds. The real, messy, unprofitable pain happening in the apartment next door, or in the silent heart of a friend, goes unseen. The signal of true distress is drowned out by the noise of simulated emotion. The tear, as a cry for help, loses its potency, its power to compel action diluted in a world that has seen it all before and has grown weary. But what if the value of a tear was never meant to be determined by an outside witness? What if, in stripping away its social power, we are forced to confront its most private, primal purpose? Perhaps the tear that falls in absolute solitude, unseen and unvalidated by any other, is not a signal of fading, but the very proof of a presence refusing to be extinguished. It is a message not to the tribe, but to the self. A single salty testament whispered into the void. I am here, I feel this, and therefore I still am.